You've just ruined your life!
Your father didn't build this empire, he stole it from the man who actually trusted him.
He walked into that boardroom carrying nothing but a manila folder and a cup of gas station coffee. No suit jacket, no briefcase, no assistant whispering in his ear, just a single dad who dropped his kid off at school 40 minutes earlier and still had a juice box stain on his sleeve. They laughed at him, every single one of them. By the time he left, he had torn a $50 million contract in half with his bare hands, and not one person in that room understood what had just happened. But they would. If this story already has you leaning forward, you're going to want to stay until the very end. Drop a like and leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The alarm went off at 5:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before it was supposed to. Ethan Calloway lay still for a moment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling above his bed, the one shaped vaguely like the state of Florida that he'd been meaning to fix for 2 years and never had. The October air had crept through the gap in the window he'd also been meaning to fix. He could hear the old pipes complaining in the walls, the neighborhood dog 2 houses down barking at nothing, the faint sound of a garbage truck making its rounds somewhere on Magnolia Street. He reached over and killed the alarm before it could wake Noah. That was the first calculation of the day. There were always calculations. How loud to close the refrigerator, which floorboards to step around in the hallway, whether to run the coffee maker before or after the shower. 7 years of solo parenting had turned Ethan Calloway into an expert at moving through the world without disturbing it. He sat up slowly, rolled his neck until something cracked, and put his feet on the cold hardwood floor. The house wasn't much. A narrow 2-story on the east side of Charleston, squeezed between a retired postal worker named Clarence and a rotating cast of college students who threw parties on Thursday nights and apologized on Friday mornings. 3 bedrooms, one of which Ethan used as an office. A kitchen where the cabinet door above the sink had been hanging at a slight angle since before his wife died, and he still hadn't fixed it because every time he looked at it, he thought of her standing on her tiptoes trying to reach the coffee mugs, complaining that he'd installed the shelves too high on purpose. He hadn't, but he'd never corrected her either. He put on yesterday's jeans, a clean shirt, and padded down the hallway past Noah's room. The door was cracked open the way it always was. He looked in out of habit. His son was still asleep, one arm thrown over his head, mouth slightly open, the comforter pulled sideways so that it covered mostly his feet, and basically nothing else. 7 years old, and already sleeping like a disaster zone. Ethan went downstairs, started the coffee, and opened his laptop at the kitchen table. A new email had arrived at 3:22 a.m. from a paralegal at Meridian Legal Group named Stephanie Cho, who apparently worked through the night as a personal policy. Mr. Calloway, final document set has been uploaded. Full package, 2,847 pages. Review deadline is Monday. Signing ceremony is Thursday. Board has been informed of your scope. Standard compliance review, no advisory authority. Please coordinate directly with Mr. Hargrove's office if you have questions. He read it twice. No advisory authority. He understood what that meant. He was there to check boxes, to confirm that the contract didn't have any obvious legal landmines that would embarrass someone later, to sign off on a document that had already been reviewed by 3 different law firms, 2 financial consultants, and probably a partridge in a pear tree. He was the last stop before the ink dried. The formality. Ethan poured his coffee and pulled up the first file. The job had come through his usual channel, a referral from a former colleague named Marcus Webb, who now ran a mid-sized compliance firm in Columbia and threw him work whenever something came up that was too specialized or too sensitive to handle in-house. Marcus had called him on a Thursday evening 2 weeks ago while Ethan was standing in the school pickup line listening to Noah argue with another kid about whether sharks could live in rivers. "I've got something for you," Marcus said. "Big deal. Sterling Meridian. You know them?" Ethan knew the name. Sterling Meridian Capital, one of the fastest-growing private holding companies in the Southeast. The kind of operation that bought failing companies, restructured them, and sold them for 3 times the price. Very successful. Very private. Very careful about its public image. "I know of them," Ethan said. "CEO is Isabella Sterling, daughter of Richard Sterling. You remember him?" Vaguely. He built the original company 20 years ago. There was some kind of fraud scandal about 12 years back. He stepped down, the company restructured. His daughter inherited what was left and rebuilt it from scratch. Now it's worth... I don't even want to tell you what it's worth. Then don't. North of $2 billion. You told me. They're closing a shipping deal, $50 million, multi-year agreement with a logistics group called Coastal Meridian Partners. The legal team has signed off, but they want an independent compliance review before execution. That's you. Standard scope. 2 weeks, full document access, you submit your report, you attend the signing ceremony Thursday as the compliance signatory. Noah had materialized next to the car window, pressing his face against the glass. Ethan unlocked it without thinking. Pay? He said. Marcus named a number. Ethan was quiet for a moment. That's not standard scope money, Marcus. No, it's not. What aren't you telling me? There was a pause on the other end. Probably nothing, but the deal's been pushed through fast, faster than usual. And Hargrove, that's the COO, Gerald Hargrove. He's been with the company about 15 years. He's been the one pushing it. I just thought it might be worth having someone careful look at it. Noah had climbed into the back seat and was already pulling at his seatbelt. Dad, can we get Chick-fil-A? No. Why? Because it's 5:15 and you had a full lunch. I'm a growing boy. You're 7. Exactly. Ethan had taken the job. That had been 2 weeks ago. Now he sat at his kitchen table in the early October dark, on his 3rd cup of coffee, surrounded by printed documents, color-coded tabs, and a legal pad with 3 pages of handwritten notes in his cramped, nearly illegible shorthand. The first week had been normal. Corporate language, standard liability clauses, the usual thicket of indemnification paragraphs designed to protect everyone from everything while committing to basically nothing. He'd flagged a few minor issues, sent them to Stephanie Cho's office, received revisions within 48 hours. Efficient, professional, clean. The second week was when things stopped being normal. It started with the ownership structure of Coastal Meridian Partners. On paper, it was a straightforward logistics company based in Savannah, Georgia, registered in Delaware like half the companies in America. 3 named executives, a functional website with stock photos of shipping containers and people in hard hats. But when Ethan started pulling on the thread of the ownership structure, which was his job, technically, though nobody expected him to pull very hard, he found something that didn't sit right. Coastal Meridian Partners was owned 70% by a holding company called Tidewater Equity Solutions. Fine. Tidewater Equity Solutions was incorporated in the Cayman Islands. Less fine, but not unusual. Tidewater Equity Solutions was itself owned by 2 entities, a trust called the Harrow Family Trust and a shell company called Great Bay Holdings, registered in the British Virgin Islands. He'd spent 2 days trying to find anything public about Great Bay Holdings. He found almost nothing. A registration date, a registered agent address that turned out to be a law firm in Tortola that handled registrations for hundreds of entities. One reference in a financial database, buried in a footnote of a much larger document from 2019. But that footnote pointed to a name. The name connected to a company. The company connected to a federal investigation from 12 years ago, an investigation that had destroyed Richard Sterling. Ethan sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. He checked his watch. It was 6:14 in the morning. He heard the floorboard at the top of the stairs creak, the one he always stepped over. Noah appeared at the bottom of the stairs in his pajamas, hair sideways, dragging his stuffed elephant by one ear. "You didn't sleep," Noah said. He said it the way a much older person would say it. It always startled Ethan how his son could sound like that. "I slept a little." "You didn't. Your eyes are red." "I'm fine, bud." "Can I have cereal?" "Yes." Noah climbed up onto his chair at the table and looked at the stacks of paper. "Is this your job?" "Yeah." "Is it boring?" "It was," Ethan said. "It's getting less boring. The building was the kind that made you feel the weight of other people's money the moment you walked in. 40 floors of glass and steel on Meeting Street, with a lobby that had marble floors and an abstract sculpture that cost more than Ethan's house and looked like someone had melted a bicycle. He'd been coming here every day for 2 weeks. He had a temporary badge. He knew the security guard's name, Tony, who was originally from New Jersey and wanted everyone to know it. He knew which elevator was fastest and which conference room had the best Wi-Fi and which coffee machine on the 14th floor actually worked. But he didn't know Isabella Sterling. He'd seen her 3 times. Once in the lobby, on the phone, walking fast in heels that hit the marble floor like punctuation. Once through the glass wall of her corner office on the 38th floor, sitting at a long table with 6 other people and a whiteboard covered in numbers. And once in the elevator where she'd glanced at him, at his contractor badge, at his slightly too casual clothes, and looked back at her phone without acknowledgement. He wasn't offended. He understood what he looked like from where she was standing. He was infrastructure, a formality with a badge. What he knew about her, he knew from public record and industry gossip that Marcus had shared over the years. Isabella Sterling had graduated from Duke at 19, an MBA from Wharton at 22. She'd gone to work for a financial consulting firm in New York, built a reputation for being the smartest and most ruthless person in whatever room she was in, and come back to Charleston at 25 when her father's company was in ruins, and bought the remaining assets with a combination of private investment and the kind of personal conviction that either looks like genius or delusion until you know how it ends. It ended with $2 billion and a company that the business press called a phoenix story. She was 30 years old and had rebuilt a dead empire with her bare hands, and she was about to sign a contract that would put a very significant piece of that empire in someone else's pocket, whether she knew it or not. Ethan requested a meeting with Gerald Hargrove's office on Monday morning. Gerald Hargrove was 61, silver-haired, and had the practiced warmth of a man who had spent decades being liked by people he needed things from. He'd joined Sterling Meridian 14 years ago, when Isabella was still in business school and the company was half its current size, and had worked his way up to COO with a reputation for deal-making and operational efficiency. His assistant, a young man named Patrick, called back within the hour. "Mr. Hargrove is fully booked through Thursday," Patrick said. "I can get you 15 minutes on Friday?" "The signing is Thursday," Ethan said. "Yes, I know. That's why he's booked." "I have questions about the ownership structure of Coastal Meridian Partners that need to be addressed before Thursday." A pause. "I'll let him know you called." He never heard back. He tried twice more. Once through Stephanie Cho's office, once directly through the firm's internal messaging system. Both times he received polite responses that said nothing and committed to nothing and moved the timeline past Thursday like a hand sliding something off a table. On Wednesday morning, he sent a formal written notice to the board's general counsel, a woman named Dr. Patricia Vance, outlining 3 specific concerns about the ownership chain of Coastal Meridian Partners. He didn't state his conclusion outright. He stated the facts as he found them and asked for clarification. Dr. Vance's office responded with a call from one of her associates, not Vance herself, who told him that his concerns had been reviewed, that the deal had been vetted by multiple parties, and that his role as compliance signatory was to confirm regulatory compliance, not to evaluate the strategic merits of the transaction. He understood what that meant, too. They weren't going to stop. He went home that night, made Noah dinner, scrambled eggs with toast because it was Wednesday, and Wednesday was scrambled egg night, one of the small rituals they'd built together, and sat at the table watching his son eat and talk about a kid in his class who'd brought a lizard to school in his backpack. "Was the lizard okay?" Ethan asked. "Mrs. Patton took it. She said she was going to keep it over the weekend." "That's probably better than the backpack." "I guess." Noah chewed. "Dad, are you okay?" "I'm fine." "You've got that face." "What face?" "The face like when you're figuring something out, and you're not happy about what you figured out." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. "How do you even know what that looks like?" "I live with you," Noah said simply, and went back to his eggs. The signing ceremony was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Ethan arrived at 9:15. He'd spent the night finishing his notes. Not a formal report. There hadn't been time for that, and nobody had been willing to receive one. Instead, he'd put together a presentation. 41 slides. Everything he'd found, organized by date, by document, by financial trail. The shell companies. The ownership chain. the 2019 footnote, the federal case, the names that kept appearing in the wrong places. He'd also printed hard copies, 6 of them, because sometimes the most important thing you can do is put paper in people's hands. The boardroom was on the 39th floor, one below Isabella's office. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, a view of the harbor that probably made it harder to think clearly because it was genuinely beautiful, and beauty, in Ethan's experience, had a way of making people not want to believe bad things. There were 11 people in the room when he arrived, 6 members of the Sterling Meridian board, 2 executives from Coastal Meridian Partners, men in expensive suits who shook hands with the ease of people who did this often, Stephanie Cho and 2 other members of the legal team, and Gerald Hargrove standing at the far end of the room near the windows, talking to one of the Coastal Meridian executives in the low, comfortable register of men who already knew how this day was going to go. Hargrove looked up when Ethan came in. Something passed across his face. Not quite concern. Something more like mild annoyance. The look you give a fly that lands on your food. Then he looked back at his conversation. A few minutes later, Isabella Sterling walked in. She looked exactly the way she always looked, like she was moving towards something and the world was simply in the way. Dark blazer, dark slacks, hair pulled back. She was on her phone and she was talking about something that had nothing to do with this room, and she finished the call as she sat down at the head of the table with the natural authority of someone who had never had to learn how to own a room because she'd been born doing it. Her eyes swept the table. They stopped for a fraction of a second on Ethan. "You're the compliance reviewer," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Ethan Calloway." "Everything clear to sign?" "No," he said. "That's actually what I'd like to talk about." The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when someone says something that wasn't in the script. Isabella tilted her head slightly. "Mr. Calloway," her voice was even, patient even. "My team tells me your concerns were reviewed and addressed." "Your team told you that." "I'm telling you they weren't." Someone at the table, one of the board members, a heavy-set man in a gray suit, actually laughed, short and dismissive, like a bark. Gerald Hargrove had turned fully toward Ethan now. His expression was pleasant. That was the concerning part. Men like Hargrove got dangerous when they got pleasant. "Mr. Calloway," Hargrove said, "I understand you've been thorough. That's what we hired you for, but the legal team reviewed the contract for regulatory compliance," Ethan said. "They didn't dig into the ownership structure of the counterparty. Nobody did, because nobody was asked to. I was. You were asked to confirm. I was asked to conduct a compliance review. That's what I did." He looked directly at Isabella. "May I have 10 minutes?" She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was hard to read. Not dismissive, exactly. More like someone calculating odds. "We're scheduled to sign at 10, she said. "I know. 10 minutes before that, then." Hargrove cut in smoothly. "Miss Sterling, I really don't think it's productive to, Gerald." She said it quietly, just the name, and Hargrove went quiet. 10 minutes, she said to Ethan. "Make it count." He connected his laptop to the room's display system. He had practiced this. He knew he only had one shot, and he knew that most of the people in the room had already decided he was wrong. That was fine. He wasn't trying to convince most of the people in the room. He was trying to convince one. "Coastal Meridian Partners," he said. On paper, a logistics company based in Savannah. 70% owned by Tidewater Equity Solutions, a Cayman Islands holding company. Tidewater is jointly owned by the Harrow Family Trust and Great Bay Holdings, incorporated in the British Virgin Islands. He advanced the slide. Great Bay Holdings has almost no public footprint. One registered agent in Tortola, one appearance in a financial database, and a 2019 footnote attached to an SEC compliance document filed by a company called Blue Water Capital Advisors. He advanced again. Blue Water Capital Advisors. You may not recognize the name. Here's why you should. The next slide showed a newspaper headline from 12 years ago. Sterling Meridian founder resigns amid fraud investigation. Richard Sterling steps down. The room changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but it changed. He felt it the way you feel weather coming. He looked at Isabella. Her face had gone completely still. Blue Water Capital Advisors was one of the entities named in the federal investigation that preceded your father's resignation, Ethan said. The company was dissolved in 2013. Great Bay Holdings was registered in the British Virgin Islands in 2014. Different name, different registration, same registered agent office, same address. One of the two officers listed on Great Bay's registration shares a surname with a former Blue Water Capital executive who was interviewed during the 2012 federal investigation but never charged. He set a printed copy of his notes on the table in front of Isabella. The ownership trail of the company you are about to hand $50 million to runs through an entity that is connected, not conclusively, but connected, to the same financial network that was investigated in connection with your father's case 12 years ago. The silence stretched. Then the heavy-set board member said, "This is circumstantial. You're connecting dots that—" "I'm showing you the dots exist," Ethan said. "What you do with them is your decision." "You realize," Hargrove said, still pleasant, still smooth, "that delaying this deal has real consequences. We have partners committed. We have timelines." "Mr. Hargrove," Ethan turned to him, "your name doesn't appear in any of these documents. I want to be clear about that." He held Hargrove's gaze for just a moment. "I'm just showing what I found." Something flickered in Hargrove's eyes. Not much. A small thing. But Ethan had been looking for it. "Ms. Sterling," he turned back to her, "the decision is yours. It always was. I'm the compliance reviewer. My job was to tell you what I found. I've done that." He paused. "I'll leave the room if you want to discuss it privately." Isabella Sterling had not moved. She was sitting at the head of the table with her hands folded in front of her, looking at the printed document he'd put in front of her, and the expression on her face was one that Ethan recognized from a very different context. It was the expression of someone who had just heard something they already knew, somewhere underneath everything, was true. One of the Coastal Meridian executives broke the silence. "Ms. Sterling, these are unfounded concerns from a—" "Mr. Calloway," her voice was quiet. "Can you confirm that this—" she touched the document, "is everything you have, or is there more?" "There's more," he said. "I have a full 41-slide presentation and approximately 360 pages of supporting documentation that I've been trying to get someone in this building to look at for 4 days." The heavy-set board member started to speak. Isabella cut him off. "Howard, stop." She looked at the Coastal Meridian executives. "Gentlemen, I need to ask you to give us the room." They exchanged a look. "Ms. Sterling, we flew in from—" "I know where you flew in from. I'll have someone get you coffee. I need the room." She paused one beat. "Please." They left. She looked at Hargrove. Hargrove's pleasant expression had finally slipped just slightly into something less comfortable. "Isabella, this is—" "Gerald, I need you to step out too." A beat. "Isabella, Gerald," just the name, again, with something else underneath it this time. He left. Then it was Ethan and Isabella Sterling and 6 board members in a room with a $50 million contract sitting unsigned on the table between them, and through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the harbor sparkled in the October sunlight with complete indifference to any of it. "Start from the beginning," Isabella said. "All of it?" "All of it." He talked for 45 minutes. He showed her every slide. He walked her through every document, every footnote, every connection. He explained the ownership chain clearly and without embellishment, presenting only what he could demonstrate, flagging the gaps, noting where the evidence was solid and where it was circumstantial. She asked questions. Good ones. Sharp ones. She asked them with the focus of someone who had spent years learning exactly how financial structures could be used to obscure the truth, because she had lived through a version of this before, and the education had cost her everything. At no point did she interrupt him to disagree. At no point did she dismiss him or tell him to hurry up. When he finished, the room was quiet. "Why didn't anyone in the legal team catch this?" she said. "Because nobody told them to look for it. They were reviewing the contract, not the counterparty's corporate history. That's a different assignment. And nobody assigned it." "Nobody assigned it." She was quiet for a moment. "My father," she said, and then she stopped and looked at the window, and the sentence just sat there unfinished. I don't know anything about your father's case beyond what's in the public record, Ethan said. I'm not drawing any conclusions about it. I'm just telling you what I found. She nodded slowly. Who sent you to review this deal? Referral through Marcus Webb at Meridian Compliance Group. I assumed it came through your legal department. I don't know a Marcus Webb. Ethan looked at her. Then someone referred Marcus to your legal department without your knowledge. She held his gaze. Or someone in my legal department arranged it, she said quietly. He didn't answer that. It wasn't his to answer. She looked at the contract on the table, the $50 million contract sitting there in a neat stack with a pen beside it and signature flags on every relevant page. Then she looked at Ethan. You drove here today, she said. You're a contractor. You have no advisory authority. You have no stake in this company. Nobody in this building took you seriously for 2 weeks. That's accurate, he said. So why? He thought about it honestly. Because I found something that mattered, he said. And I don't know how to find something that matters and not say anything about it. She studied him for a moment, really looked at him, not at his badge, not at his clothes, but at him. Then she reached across the table, and she picked up the contract. What happened next was not something Ethan had planned. Later, he would tell Marcus that he genuinely didn't know what he was going to do until the moment he did it. He'd just reached a point somewhere in the previous 45 minutes where it was clear to him that if he walked out of this room and left that document on the table, someone would pick up that pen before the day was over. Hargrove was still in the building. The Coastal Meridian executives were still in the building. There was momentum in a room that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the weight of money and schedule and everyone's desire to have this day go the way they'd planned. Isabella Sterling was smart. She was smarter than anyone in this building gave her credit for. And she had just spent 45 minutes taking in information that had shifted something fundamental in her. But Ethan had also watched, for 2 decades, how information could be processed in one moment and rationalized away in the next, how pressure could undo clarity, how the people who had the most to lose from a decision going wrong were sometimes the last ones to reverse course. So when she lifted the contract off the table, and he saw her face, and he saw that she was looking at the document with something uncertain in her expression, something that might resolve itself wrong if he didn't do something. He stood up. He crossed the room in 4 steps. He took the contract out of her hands, and he tore it in half, the sound in a silent room, 2 sheets of paper being separated against their grain, the sharp tearing sound of $50 million being put on hold. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the room erupted. What the hell? Security? Who does this man think? 2 of the board members were on their feet. Someone was already on a phone. Isabella Sterling had gone completely still, looking at the 2 halves of the document in Ethan's hands. He set them on the table in front of her. I'm sorry, he said, and he meant it. That wasn't professional. He picked up his laptop. He gathered his printed notes. I'll send you the full digital file before noon, he said. Everything I have, all 360 pages. He looked at her directly. The entity that controls the company you were about to pay $50 million to. I'm not sure this is the last place they're going to try to collect it from. I think you need to understand who you're actually dealing with before this goes any further. Then he walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. Ms. Sterling, he said. She looked at him. For what it's worth, the deal your father walked away from 12 years ago, the investigation, the names in those documents. He paused. I don't think it went the way it was supposed to. He left before she could answer. He was in the elevator going down when his phone buzzed, a text from the school. Hi, Mr. Calloway. Just a reminder that Noah has soccer practice at 3:30 today. Can you confirm pickup? He typed back. Confirmed. I'll be there. The elevator opened on the lobby. Tony at the security desk looked up as Ethan returned his badge. Done for the day? Tony asked. Done with this one, Ethan said. He walked out through the glass doors into the October air. The harbor was a quarter-mile away. He could smell it from here. Salt and low tide and the distant sound of a boat horn somewhere out past the bridge. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, hands in his pockets. His heart was beating faster than he wanted it to. He'd just torn a $50 million contract in a room full of board members and walked out. He had no idea what came next. He had no plan beyond sending the file. He was a single dad with a juice box stain on his sleeve and a 7-year-old who needed to be at soccer practice by 3:30. He started walking toward the parking garage. He had 4.5 hours. It would be enough time to get home, walk the dog, and eat something that wasn't gas station coffee. And then he was going to go through every document one more time because he had a feeling that what he'd found so far was not the whole story. It never was. The two halves of the contract sat on the boardroom table for a long time after Ethan left. Nobody moved to pick them up right away. That was the strange thing Isabella would remember later. Not the tearing itself, not the chaos that followed, but that specific moment of collective paralysis where 11 people in an expensive room stared at a destroyed document like it was a body. Nobody wanted to be the first to touch. Then everyone started talking at once. Howard Briggs, the heavy-set board member who'd laughed earlier, was on his feet and red in the face and saying something about lawyers and liability and reviewing the terms of Ethan's contractor agreement. Patricia Vance's associate, the one who'd called Ethan to tell him his concerns were irrelevant, was frantically typing on his phone. 2 of the other board members were having a heated sidebar near the windows. Someone had gone to find the Coastal Meridian executives to tell them, what exactly? That the deal was on hold? That a contractor had lost his mind? Gerald Hargrove had come back into the room the moment he heard the commotion, and he was standing near the door now, taking in the scene with an expression that Isabella couldn't quite read. Not the pleasant mask he usually wore. Something tighter, more controlled. She was still sitting at the head of the table. She hadn't moved. She was looking at the 2 halves of the contract. Isabella. Hargrove came toward her, voice low. This is salvageable. We can have the document reprinted within the hour. The Coastal Meridian team is still in the building. We issue an apology. We explain that the compliance reviewer exceeded his authority. Gerald. She put her hand flat on the table. Stop. The timeline. Gerald. She looked up at him. I said stop. He stopped. She picked up 1/2 of the torn contract. She looked at the signature page. Her signature line. Blank, with that little paper flag on it that had been pointing at her all morning like an instruction. She set it back down. Get everyone out of this room, she said quietly. Board members can wait in the conference room on 37. Tell the Coastal Meridian team I'll be in touch by end of day. And get me Patricia Vance, not her associate. Patricia. Isabella, if we don't move quickly, the other side is going to Gerald. She finally looked at him directly, fully, the way she looked at financial statements when something didn't add up. I need the room. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he started moving people out. When the last person left and the door closed behind them, Isabella Sterling sat alone in a 39th floor boardroom with a ruined contract and a view of Charleston Harbor. And she did something she almost never let herself do. She sat still and thought. The document Ethan had left on the table, his printed summary, 40-something pages of notes in a handwriting that was almost aggressively difficult to read. She pulled it toward her and started from the beginning. She'd heard everything he'd said. She was good at listening. It was one of the things she'd trained herself to do because her instinct, always, was to push forward, and listening required her to deliberately slow down. She'd absorbed everything in that 45-minute presentation, but hearing something and sitting alone with it were different. She read through his notes slowly. The ownership chain, the shell companies, Tidewater Equity, Great Bay Holdings, the 2014 registration date, 1 year after the dissolution of Blue Water Capital Advisors. She knew the name Blue Water Capital. Of course she did. She'd been 19 years old when her father's world fell apart, and she'd spent the years since building something in its ruins, and she'd never once allowed herself to go back and look at the original case files because she'd made a decision early on that looking backward would cost her the forward momentum she needed to survive. Her father had told her not to look. He'd said sitting across from her in the kitchen of the house they'd moved to after they sold the estate, looking older than his age and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Don't dig into it, Bella. There are people who don't want it dug into. You build the company. That's the best thing you can do for me. She'd listened to him. She hadn't always agreed with him, but she'd listened. Now she was staring at a handwritten note that said, Great Bay Holdings registered agent Calder and Frome, Roadtown, Tortola. Same registered agent as Blue Water Capital Advisors per 2011 SEC filing. Coincidence possible. Intentional obfuscation equally possible. She sat with that for a while. Her phone buzzed. Hargrove. She let it go to voicemail. It buzzed again. Howard Briggs. She let that go too. She picked up the torn contract again, both halves this time, and held them together so the document was almost whole, just that jagged line running down the middle where Ethan had torn through it. She thought about the way he'd looked at her when he said it. I don't think it went the way it was supposed to. He'd said it and then walked out before she could respond, which was either calculated or just what it looked like. A man who'd said the thing he needed to say and had a soccer pickup to get to. She wasn't sure which. She set the contract down, picked up her phone, and called her personal assistant. Renata, she said when the call connected, I need everything we have on the 2012 investigation into my father's company. Internal files, legal correspondence, board communications, all of it. Whatever's in the archive. Renata was quiet for a moment. Ms. Sterling, some of those files are from before my tenure. I may need to go back as far as you need to. I want it on my desk by tonight. And the Coastal Meridian team, they're asking, tell them I'll call by 5. She paused. Actually, tell them I'll call by tomorrow morning. Tell them there's a compliance issue that requires additional review. Okay. Another pause. And Mr. Hargrove has called 3 times. I know. She looked at the harbor. The October sun was still brilliant out there, indifferent as ever. Tell him I'm in a meeting. Are you in a meeting? I'm about to be, Isabella said, and hung up. She called her father at noon. Richard Sterling lived in Mount Pleasant now, across the bridge, in a house that was comfortable but smaller than anything he'd occupied for the first 30 years of his adult life. He answered on the 3rd ring the way he always did, slightly out of breath, like she'd caught him in the middle of something physical. Hey, Bella? Were you running? Walking. Doctor said I have to do 45 minutes a day. Feels like a punishment. He caught his breath. What's going on? She'd thought about how to approach this on the elevator ride down to the parking garage, then on the drive across the bridge, then in the parking lot of the coffee shop near his neighborhood where she sometimes met him. She'd thought about being careful, measured, not alarming him. Then she'd looked at his face when he opened the car door and sat down across from her, and the careful, measured version of this conversation went out the window. Dad, she said, I need to know about Blue Water Capital. The shift in his expression was small. If she hadn't been watching for it, she would have missed it, a slight tightening around the eyes, a very brief pause before he said anything. Where did you hear that name? The deal I was closing today. I had a compliance reviewer who found a connection between the company I was buying into and Blue Water Capital, an ownership chain that goes through the same registered agent. Richard Sterling looked out through the coffee shop window, a long look. You said was closing, he said, past tense. I didn't sign. He closed his eyes for a moment. Dad, tell me about Blue Water. Bella, please. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He was quiet long enough that she started to think he was going to say what he always said. Let it go. We don't need to go back there. And then he said something else entirely. Blue Water was a financial advisory firm. We used them for about 3 years, starting around 2009. Investment structuring, tax strategy. They were good at what they did. He paused. Or I thought they were. When the investigation started, when the government started looking at the company's books, Blue Water was one of the entities named. They said I knew about the offshore structures, the hidden accounts. He stopped. I didn't. I know you didn't. You've always said that. You've always believed it. But Bella, I had a lawyer who told me that fighting it would take years and cost more than I had, and that the evidence, even if it was planted or manipulated, would be enough to... He shook his head. I stepped down. I cooperated. I gave them what they wanted, and they stopped digging. That was the deal. Who made the deal? My lawyer at the time. He negotiated with the federal investigators. And who were the federal investigators working with? On the company side? Her father was quiet. Dad? The investigation was coordinated through the company's internal legal counsel, he said carefully, and through the COO at the time, who had been given authority to cooperate with investigators on the company's behalf. Isabella's hand went still around her coffee cup. Who was the COO in 2012? Bella. Who was it? He looked at her. His face was tired in that old way, the way it had been for 12 years, the way that made him look like a man carrying weight he'd never managed to set down completely. There was a transition that year, he said. The man who held this position at the end, the one who managed the cooperating process, was brought in about 6 months before I resigned. His name? Richard Sterling took a long breath. Gerald, he said. Gerald Hargrove. Isabella drove back to the office on autopilot. She didn't remember most of the drive. She remembered getting on the bridge, and she remembered pulling into the parking garage, and she remembered sitting in the car for 4 minutes before she trusted herself to go upstairs. But the specific streets in between were gone. Gerald Hargrove had been with her company for 14 years. He had been there before her. He had been there when she was 25 years old and scared and trying to hold together what was left of her father's company with determination and private investment and the absolute refusal to show anyone how uncertain she actually was. He had been there through 3 acquisitions and 2 restructurings, and the year they almost lost everything again and somehow didn't. He had mentored her in his way. He had backed her decisions in board meetings when other people pushed back. He had been, she had believed, one of the most loyal people in her organization. She sat in the parking garage and thought about what loyalty actually was. It was Renata's knock on her car window that pulled her back. The assistant had come down to find her when she didn't appear after 30 minutes. Ms. Sterling? Renata looked at her through the glass with the practiced expression of someone who had worked for difficult, brilliant people long enough to know when not to ask direct questions. Isabella got out of the car. I need those archive files, she said. They're being pulled now. IT says some of them are on the old server and might take until tonight. I need them tonight. Yes, ma'am. And Renata, she stopped. Don't tell Gerald I'm looking at them. Don't tell anyone. Renata didn't blink. Of course. The digital file from Ethan arrived at 11:47 that morning. A compressed folder with 360 pages of documents, organized by date and clearly labeled. He'd included a cover memo, 4 paragraphs, that laid out his methodology and stated explicitly that the conclusions were circumstantial and would require additional investigation to confirm or refute. He'd also included his phone number at the bottom with a line that said, "If you want to talk through any of this, I'm available." She read the cover memo twice. Then she picked up her phone and called the number. It rang 4 times. She was preparing to leave a voicemail when he picked up, and there was a noise in the background that took her a second to identify. A child, somewhere close, saying something she couldn't make out. Mr. Calloway. A brief pause. Ms. Sterling. She heard the background noise shift, like he'd moved to a different room. You got the file. I got the file. She looked at her desk where the cover memo was sitting on top of the stack of printed archive documents that Renata had brought up an hour ago. I also had a conversation with my father. Silence on his end. Waiting. He told me who the COO was in 2012, she said. The person who managed the company's cooperation with the federal investigation. I see. I don't think you do. It was Gerald Hargrove. The silence on his end was different this time. Longer. That's not in anything I found, he said. No, it's not in the public record. My father told me directly. She paused. Gerald joined the company 6 months before my father resigned. The previous COO had been pushed out. Health reasons, officially. Gerald came in and within 6 months was managing the federal response. Okay, he said, and she could hear him thinking. Okay, does Hargrove know you're looking at this? No. Keep it that way for now. I'm already ahead of you on that. She looked out her office window. The harbor again. Always the harbor. Mr. Calloway, what were you doing before you became a compliance consultant? A pause that was slightly too long. Why? Because the way you organize those documents isn't how compliance reviewers organize documents. It's how investigators organize evidence. And you told my board this morning that nobody assigned you to look at the ownership chain, but you looked at it anyway. That suggests either professional habit or personal interest. Or I'm thorough, he said. You're more than thorough. She kept her voice even. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm trying to understand who I'm dealing with. Another pause, shorter this time. I worked for the federal government for 6 years, he said. Financial Crimes Unit. I left in 2019. Why did you leave? Personal reasons. She waited. My wife got sick, he said. She needed care, then she needed more care. And then she died, and I had a 3-year-old in a job that required me to be somewhere else 70% of the time, and I made a choice. She hadn't expected that. She was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. It was a few years ago. His voice was matter of fact. Not dismissive, just something that had been lived with long enough to be carried without collapsing under it. What cases did you work on? She said. At the Financial Crimes Unit. Various ones. Gerald Hargrove? Pause. I worked on a case that touched some of the same financial networks as the 2012 Sterling investigation, he said. I wasn't the lead. I was an analyst. The case was closed before it fully developed. Why was it closed? Political influence. He said it flatly, without drama. These things happen. Powerful people have powerful friends, and sometimes the investigation ends before the truth does. But you kept the evidence. A long pause. Some of it, he said. I kept what I was legally allowed to keep, which wasn't everything, but it was enough to recognize what I was looking at when I started digging into that ownership chain. Isabella stood up from her desk and walked to the window. She pressed her fingertips against the glass, which was cold. You knew before you came in this morning, she said. You knew what you'd found. I suspected. But you didn't go to anyone else, not the press, not a regulator, not federal law enforcement. You came to a board meeting and asked for 10 minutes. Because I didn't have proof, he said. Suspicion and proof are different things. I had enough to raise a flag. I didn't have enough to walk into a federal building and make an accusation that would stick. Do you have enough now, with what my father told me? Your father's testimony about who managed the corporate response in 2012 is important, but it needs to be corroborated, and we'd need to establish a direct connection between Hargrove and the ownership structure of Great Bay Holdings, not just circumstantial proximity. We, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Figure of speech. Is it? Another pause. She could hear his son again in the background calling about something. Ms. Sterling, he said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly. Go ahead. What I found in those documents could be exactly what it looks like, or there could be pieces missing that would explain it differently. I'm not wrong often, but I'm not never wrong. If we go down this road and it turns out the connection is coincidental, the damage to your company from having delayed this deal, from having accused your COO of whatever this amounts to, could be severe. I want you to understand that before you decide anything. She looked at the harbor. Gerald Hargrove has been with my company for 14 years, she said. He was in that room 12 years ago when my father was pushed out. He helped build what I've been building since then. If he's been doing what your documents suggest, she stopped. If he's been doing that, then everything I've built is sitting on a lie, and I need to know. Even if knowing it costs you. Especially then, she said it without hesitation. Mr. Calloway, will you help me find the rest of it? The silence on his end stretched long enough that she thought he might say no. She was already planning her next step. She knew people. She could find another investigator. She could hire a firm. When he spoke, I'll need access to your internal financial records going back 15 years, he said. Not through the legal department. Direct access, administrator level. And I'll need to know that no one else in the company is told I'm doing this. Done. And I'll need, this is going to sound strange, I'll need to bring my son to the office on Saturday. His school is closed and I don't have childcare until Monday. She blinked. Your son? He's 7. He'll sit in a corner and do a puzzle. He's very quiet when he wants to be. You can bring your son, she said. Okay. A breath. Then yeah, I'll help. Sin. The next 4 days were the longest Isabella Sterling could remember in years, and her life had not exactly been short on long days. She moved carefully. That was the hardest part. The deliberate slowness of it, the need to act normal in a building where she could no longer look at Gerald Hargrove without her skin prickling. She sat across from him in a Tuesday operations meeting and listened to him talk about Q4 projections, and smiled at the right moments and answered his questions about the Coastal Meridian situation by saying that she was doing additional diligence and would have an update soon. He'd pushed back on that, gently, the way he always pushed back on things he didn't like. Not confrontationally, but persistently, finding new angles, new reasonable-sounding reasons why the delay was costing them. The Coastal Meridian team is getting nervous, he said, after the Tuesday meeting, when the others had filed out and it was just the two of them. They've got their own commitments riding on this. If we wait much longer, they may look for other partners. Let them look, she said. He studied her. That's not like you. People surprise themselves sometimes. Isabella. He sat down across from her in the way he sometimes did, that practiced ease, the posture of a man who was comfortable in this relationship and wanted her to feel it. I know this morning was unsettling. That contractor was out of line. What was out of line about it? He paused. He destroyed a legal document in a board meeting. He raised concerns that nobody had raised before, and then he illustrated how serious he thought they were. She kept her voice neutral. Gerald, I've been thinking about going back and reviewing some of the older corporate records, historical stuff, just wanting to make sure I fully understand the company's financial architecture before I sign anything this significant. Of course, that makes sense. His voice was smooth. Anything you need, I can pull together. I'd like to do it myself, she said, directly, with Renata. A very brief pause. Of course, whatever you need. She looked at him across the table. 14 years is a long time, she said. It is. He smiled. Doesn't feel that long. No, she agreed. It doesn't. Saturday morning, Ethan arrived at the building at 8:30 with a 7-year-old in a dinosaur hoodie who was carrying a backpack that appeared to be entirely full of Legos. Security called up. Isabella told them to let him through. She met them on the 38th floor. Noah Calloway looked up at her with the frank evaluation of a young child who hadn't yet learned to pretend he wasn't assessing people. You're the billionaire, he said. Noah. Ethan's voice had the slightly weary patience of a parent who had given up being embarrassed. I'm the CEO, Isabella said. It's a job title, like a doctor or a teacher. Noah considered this. My teacher makes really good macaroni pictures. I don't make macaroni pictures, Isabella said. I'm pretty bad at crafts. Noah nodded, apparently satisfied with this honesty, and looked around the office. Can I sit by the window? You can sit wherever you want, she said. He went immediately to the window, sat down cross-legged on the floor with his backpack, and began pulling out Legos with the focused energy of someone who had a project in mind and no intention of being distracted from it. Ethan watched him for a second, then looked at Isabella. Sorry about that. Don't be. She looked at the kid by the window, who was already deep in whatever he was building. He's fine. Come look at what I pulled. They worked for 6 hours. Ethan went through financial records from 2011 to 2019 with the systematic attention of someone who had done this for a living and hadn't forgotten how. Isabella worked alongside him, asking questions and pulling up documents on the parallel terminal, and somewhere in the second hour they stopped being a CEO and a contractor and became something more like two people who were very angry about the same thing and had decided to do something about it. What they found was not explosive at first. It was small. It was the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking and were designed to be missed. A series of internal fund transfers from 2013 and 2014 moved between subsidiary accounts in amounts just below the threshold that would trigger automatic review. A vendor contract from 2015 for consulting services. The vendor name was different from anything in Ethan's documents, but the registered agent address was the same Tortola law firm. A board resolution from 2016 authorizing Hargrove to approve expenditures up to $10 million without additional board sign-off, passed at a meeting where 2 of the 5 board members were absent. He was expanding his own authority gradually, Ethan said. He'd been quiet for a while, reading, and then he said it almost to himself, like he was testing the sentence to see if it was true. "One piece at a time," Isabella said. "Over 15 years. Patient. Slow. The kind of operation where you know you're going to be in the building for a long time, so you don't rush." "The deal," she said. "The Coastal Meridian deal. If we'd signed it, what happens?" He sat back. He'd been thinking about this. She could tell by the way he'd organized his notes in the last hour. He was building toward something. Great Bay Holdings is the ultimate beneficial owner of a significant stake in Coastal Meridian Partners, he said. Once you pay $50 million into that deal, a percentage of that money flows through the ownership structure. Some of it goes to legitimate operational costs. Some of it gets processed through Tidewater equity in the Caymans. Some of it ends up... He paused. "I'd need to trace the final destination. But the secondary clause in the contract, the one on page 847, the one about licensing rights, that clause effectively gives the counterparty co-signing authority on Sterling Meridian's logistics agreements for the next decade." "He'd control the logistics arm," Isabella said, "through a shell company that nobody can easily trace back to him, without ever showing up as an officer or director of your company." He looked at her, elegant in a terrible way. 15 years, she said again, quietly, to herself. Maybe more. The network was already there when he arrived. He may have been building the vehicle before he ever walked through your door. "He used my company," she said, and her voice had something in it that wasn't quite anger yet. It was the thing that comes before anger, the cold recognition of a truth you'd rather not know. "He used my father's company. He helped push my father out, and then he stayed in the building and used what was left." "That's what it looks like." "That's what it is," she said. She wasn't interested in cushioning it. "That's what it is." She stood up and walked to the window. Noah had built something substantial. She couldn't tell what it was supposed to be, but it had towers and what appeared to be a bridge. He was studying it with the serious expression of someone considering modifications. She looked at the harbor. "What do we still need?" she said. "Direct connection between Hargrove and Great Bay Holdings. Something that puts him in the ownership chain. A document, a wire transfer, a communication. Right now we have strong circumstantial evidence in your father's testimony. We need something that links him personally. Where would we find it? If it exists, it's probably not in your records. He would have kept his own exposure out of anything you could access. It might be in the federal case files from 2012, the investigation that was closed. I know someone who might be able to pull those." "Someone you trust?" He thought about it. "Someone who's been irritated about that closed case for about 12 years, he said. "So yes, more or less." From the window, Noah said, without looking up from his Legos, "Dad, I'm hungry." "We'll get lunch in a bit, bud." "Is there food in this building?" Isabella looked at the kid. "There's a kitchen on this floor. It has..." She tried to remember what was actually in there. She hadn't eaten from it in months. Probably granola bars and yogurt, and I think someone left a box of crackers last week. Noah looked at her. "Are you hungry?" She realized she was. She hadn't eaten since 6 in the morning. "Actually, yeah, I am." "Dad never eats when he's working," Noah said, returning to his Legos. "You have to make him." Ethan looked briefly embarrassed in the specific way of a person who had just been accurately described by someone half his height. "We should eat," Isabella said. "I'm not done with the 2015 files. They'll still be wrong when we get back." She stood up. "Come on, your son is right." He looked at her for a second, then at Noah, then back at her. "He usually is," he said, and closed the laptop. Yes. They ate crackers and granola bars in the 38th floor kitchen while Noah sat on the counter and explained at considerable length the structural logic of the Lego creation he was building. It was apparently a space station with an underwater component, which he acknowledged was scientifically implausible, but maintained was architecturally interesting. Isabella listened to him explain why the bridge between the 2 sections needed to have extra support columns, and somewhere in the middle of it she thought, I used to be that certain about things. before I learned what the world actually does to certainty. But she also thought that's not a bad way to be. When they went back to work, they went back with something slightly different between them. Not friendship exactly. Something more practical than that. The specific alignment of two people who had looked at the same problem from different angles and decided, without a formal agreement, to look at it together instead. By 4 in the afternoon, Ethan had sent a message to his contact in the federal records system, a woman named Agent Diane Rosario, who had been the lead investigator on the 2012 case before it was shut down, and who had, according to Ethan, never stopped being angry about it. By 5, Renata had quietly scanned and sent 14 years of board meeting minutes that had never been fully digitized. By 6, Noah had fallen asleep on the floor next to his Lego space station, his dinosaur hoodie balled up under his head. And by 6:45, Ethan had found something in the 2016 board resolution approving Hargrove's expanded authority. Something in the attachment, a list of pre-approved vendors buried on page 12, that made him go very still and then say, quietly, "Isabella." She looked up from her screen. "Come look at this," he said. She came around the desk. He pointed at a line on the screen. Vendor number 7C, Great Bay Holdings, BVI. Approved for operational consulting services, fiscal year 2016 to 2019. "He put them in your approved vendor list," she said. 3 years before the Coastal Meridian deal, he was already running money through them. He sat back. He had access to company funds, vendor relationships, and a 15-year paper trail that looked completely legitimate. And nobody ever had a reason to question it because nobody was looking. She stared at the screen. "Until you were," she said. He didn't respond to that. He was already pulling up the next set of documents. She looked at her COO's name in a board resolution he had helped draft, authorizing payments to a shell company he controlled, and she felt something go cold and very quiet inside her. Not grief exactly, and not rage either. Something that was going to become one or the other later when there was time for it. Not yet. Right now there was still work to do. The vendor entry sat on Ethan's screen. Great Bay Holdings, BVI, line item 7C. And neither of them said anything for almost a full minute. That was the thing about finding the piece you'd been looking for. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt like confirmation of something you'd half hoped was wrong, and the rightness of it sat in your chest with weight instead of satisfaction. Ethan printed the page, added it to the stack, and wrote 3 lines of notes in his legal pad. His handwriting got worse when he was thinking hard. The letters compressed, the words tilted slightly. And this was some of the worst handwriting he'd produced in days. Isabella stood behind him reading over his shoulder. He was aware of that. He was also aware that at some point in the last 8 hours, the professional distance between them had shifted into something more like a working partnership, which was fine, and also slightly complicated because she was still technically his client, and he was still technically a contractor whose engagement had probably expired the moment he tore the contract in half. "How does he access the money?" Isabella said. She was still looking at the screen. "The vendor payments? They go to Great Bay Holdings. But Great Bay is a shell. There has to be a layer beneath it where the money actually lands. That's what I need from Rosario." He capped his pen. If the federal case touched Great Bay's banking relationships, even peripherally, there may be wire records, account numbers, beneficiary information. He looked at the printed page. "This is enough to make the conversation with her real. Before, I was calling in a favor based on intuition. Now I have a document that places Great Bay Holdings inside your company's approved vendor list. That's a thread she can pull. How long will it take her to pull it?" "I don't know. She's not doing this officially. She'll be pulling old files in whatever spare time she has, which may not be much." Isabella nodded. She went back around to the other side of the desk and sat down and looked at her own screen. The board resolution was still open. Gerald Hargrove's name appeared 6 times on the document, which was 6 more times than she wanted to see it right now. From the floor, Noah shifted in his sleep. He'd pulled his dinosaur hoodie over his face at some point, which was a choice she found both baffling and oddly endearing. Ethan glanced over at him, checking, then looked back at his laptop. "You should take him home," Isabella said, "in a few minutes. It's almost 7. He's been here since 8:30. He's fine. He sleeps anywhere." "Ethan." She said his first name and then looked slightly surprised that she had. And he looked slightly surprised too, and then they both let it go. Go home. We're not going to crack the rest of this tonight, and you'll think better tomorrow. He looked at the screen. She could see him weighing it, the pull of the work against the pull of the kid sleeping on the floor. The 2016 files, he said. I'll finish reading them tonight. I'll send you notes. You don't have to, I know what I'm looking at now. You explained it clearly. She paused. And I want to do something useful. I don't do well just waiting. He looked at her, and in the way of people who are both direct when necessary, something was communicated without being said, that they understood each other well enough now for this to work, and that it was going to be harder than either of them had probably wanted it to be. Okay, he said. He closed the laptop. He walked over to where Noah was sleeping on the floor and crouched down beside him. Hey, Bud, time to go. Noah made a noise. I know, come on. Noah sat up with the hoodie over his face, looked at the world from inside it for a moment, then pulled it off. His hair was sideways again. He looked at the Lego construction beside him, then at his father, then at Isabella. Is the space station safe? He asked. I'll make sure nobody touches it, Isabella said. He seemed to consider whether to trust her on this. Okay. He started dismantling it anyway, packing the pieces back into his bag. When Ethan looked like he was going to help, Noah held up a hand. I've got it, Dad. Ethan sat back on his heels and waited. She watched the two of them for a moment. The easy, unspoken choreography of it. A father and son who had figured out the geometry of each other through years of daily proximity. The way Ethan watched Noah without hovering. The way Noah moved with a kind of competence that suggested he'd been doing things himself for a long time. She thought about her own father, sitting in that coffee shop with his hands around his cup. Don't dig into it, Bella. She'd spent 12 years listening to that advice. After they left, the 38th floor was very quiet. She ordered food from the place 3 blocks over that delivered until midnight, ate at her desk, and read through the rest of the 2016 files with her own notes in the margins. By 9 o'clock, she'd found 2 more vendor payments to Great Bay Holdings from 2017, each under the reporting threshold, each approved by Hargrove's office under the expanded authority the board had given him. By 10, she'd gone back further, to 2013 and 2014, and found something she almost missed. A consultant agreement from early 2014, just months after Blue Water Capital had been dissolved, with a vendor whose registered agent was listed only as Calder and Frome, Tortola. No company name, no specific description of services, just a billing address and a quarterly fee. She took a picture of it with her phone and texted it to Ethan with the message, 2014. Pre-Great Bay, same agent. He responded 4 minutes later, found it. Consistent with the transition period, old structure dissolving, new one forming, save everything. She saved everything. At 10:45, her personal phone rang. The screen said Gerald. She looked at it for 3 rings. Then she picked up. I'm in the office late, she said before he could lead with anything. I know, I saw the light. A pause. He was in his car, she could tell. The specific quiet of a vehicle that wasn't moving. I was working late too, wanted to check on you. I'm fine. Isabella. His voice had the careful quality it got when he was going to say something he'd prepared. I've been thinking about Thursday, about Calloway. I think he got under your skin more than he should have. Maybe. He's a contractor. He had no business. Gerald, let's not do this tonight. She kept her voice easy. Not warm, but easy. I'm going through some old files. I'll call you in the morning. Which files? She picked up her coffee cup and found it empty. Historical stuff. I told you on Tuesday, I want to understand the full financial architecture before we move on anything significant. I can help with that. I know those files better than... I'm fine. I'll talk to you tomorrow. A pause. All right, he said. Get some rest. You too. She hung up. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand, then she reached over, opened her laptop, and kept reading. Diane Rosario called Ethan on Monday morning, which was faster than he'd expected. He was in the school drop-off line, second car from the front, when his phone buzzed with a number he hadn't seen in 2 years, but recognized immediately. He handed Noah his backpack and watched him run to the school entrance and then pulled forward and answered before the call went to voicemail. Rosario. You have some nerve, she said, which was how she'd started approximately half their conversations when they'd worked together. After 2 years of radio silence, you call me on a Sunday night asking for archived files on a closed federal case. I found something. You always find something. That's not actually the problem, Calloway. He heard her sigh, the long-practiced kind that meant she'd been chewing on this for a while. I pulled the Great Bay registration. You're right that the Calder and Frome connection exists. It's not in the public file, but I have it in the working documents from 2012. And Great Bay Holdings wasn't part of the original investigation. It couldn't have been. It wasn't registered until 2014. But the working documents reference a pattern of BVI-registered entities using the same agent for what the investigators described as Phase 2 restructuring. The theory was that whatever network was operating through Blue Water Capital was building successor structures in anticipation of the investigation going public. They closed before they could prove it. Yes, because someone decided we'd found enough. The specific weight in her voice on that sentence, she hadn't let it go either. He'd known she wouldn't have, but hearing it still confirmed something. Who made that call? He said. Closing the case. You never told me directly, because I didn't know directly. I knew it came down from above my pay grade, and I knew the timing, 2 weeks after we requested voluntary cooperation from Sterling Meridian's internal legal team. Somebody made a phone call somewhere, and suddenly the resource allocation shifted, and 6 months later the case was administratively closed. She paused. You're telling me the COO who managed that voluntary cooperation process is the same man currently working at the company? He's been there 14 years. And you think he's running money through a successor entity? I know he is. I have a vendor approval document from 2016 with Great Bay Holdings on it, authorized under his expanded board authority, payments consistent with a transfer pattern designed to stay under reporting thresholds. The silence on her end was thoughtful, different from the earlier silence. What do you need from me? She said. Banking relationships. If the 2012 working documents have any wire records connected to the Blue Water network, account numbers, beneficiary details, anything that might connect to Great Bay Holdings or its beneficial owners. The working documents from a closed federal investigation, she said. Yes. That I'd be accessing outside of any official capacity. Yes. A longer pause this time. Ethan, you understand what I'm risking. I do. I wouldn't ask if I didn't think it mattered. It always matters to you. That's part of your problem. But her voice had shifted slightly, from skeptical towards something else. The woman who owns the company. Sterling. What's she doing with this? Everything I ask her to. Is she solid? He thought about Saturday. About Isabella sitting across from him at 10 o'clock at night in an empty office, reading through 14 years of financial records with careful, focused attention, asking the right questions and not flinching at the answers. About the way she'd looked at Hargrove's name in those documents, with the hard, contained expression of someone choosing not to feel something until they had time to feel it properly. She's solid, he said. Okay? Another breath. I'll look. It'll take a few days. And Calloway, if I find what you're looking for, we're not stopping at the civil case. If there are wire records that connect Hargrove to Great Bay Holdings, and those records connect to the Sterling Meridian accounts, we're talking about federal wire fraud. Possible RICO implications depending on the network size. I know. That means this doesn't stay private. Whatever your client thinks she wants, at some point this goes to an actual federal case. I know, he said again. She knows. Does she? She's the one who said especially then, he said, when I asked her if she wanted the truth, even if it cost her. Rosario was quiet for a moment. All right, she said. I'll call when I have something. Psst. The week that followed had the particular quality of a clock running too slow. Ethan worked from home during the days and went to the Sterling Meridian building 3 evenings after Noah was in bed, using the administrator credentials Isabella had set up for him. He was building a comprehensive financial timeline. Every vendor payment, every fund transfer, every board approval that touched Gerald Hargrove's authority, going back to 2011. He organized everything by date and by dollar amount, tracking the pattern of below-threshold transfers the way you track a river by the bends it makes rather than the water itself. Isabella sent him notes almost every night. She was thorough in a way he hadn't expected, and precise in a way that suggested she hadn't just built a company, but had built it by understanding every mechanism inside it. Her questions were specific and useful. She never asked for context he'd already provided, never made him repeat himself. She had a mind that organized information quickly and didn't waste his time, which he appreciated more than he could say. They talked on the phone on Wednesday evening. He was at his kitchen table, the house quiet, Noah asleep upstairs, the October cold coming through the window he still hadn't fixed. "Hargrove's being careful," she said. She sounded tired, a specific kind of tired, the kind that comes not from physical exhaustion, but from the sustained effort of acting normal in a situation that is not normal. He came into my office twice today with reasons to move on the Coastal Meridian deal. New angles, new arguments. He told me the delay was affecting investor confidence. Is it? No, I checked with our IR team. Nobody said anything. A pause. He's managing me. He's been doing it for years and I didn't see it. And now that I see it, every conversation feels like... She stopped. It's like looking at one of those optical illusions. Once your brain flips the image, you can't flip it back. I know the feeling. Is that from experience? A specific kind. He thought about cases he'd worked. About the moment in an investigation when the picture assembles itself and you can't unsee it. About how that was useful professionally and costly personally. When I was at the Financial Crimes Unit, the worst part of the job wasn't finding the fraud. It was the period between finding it and being able to act on it. When you have to keep going into meetings and being professional and normal while carrying around something that feels like it's going to catch fire. She was quiet for a moment. Does it get easier? You get better at it, he said. That's not the same thing. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. No, it isn't. He heard something on her end, a door or maybe a window, the ambient sound of her space. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. When you were at the Financial Crimes Unit, the 2012 case, you said you worked it as an analyst, not lead. What does that mean, practically? He considered how much to say. The lead investigator was Rosario. I was brought in about 4 months in, specifically to trace financial structures, the offshore network, the shell company architecture. That was my specialty. And you found things. We found things. Then the case closed before we could do anything with them. How did that feel? He looked at the window, the gap where the cold came through. He'd been meaning to fix that window for so long it had become part of the landscape. Like swallowing something, he said. Something you couldn't get back up. He paused. I had a daughter. Well, my wife was pregnant when the case closed. Our daughter was born 4 months later, and she lived for 11 days. The silence on Isabella's end was the kind that meant she'd gone very still. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I don't talk about it. You asked how it felt, and that's the context for the answer. Everything felt wrong that year. The case closing was just one more wrong thing. He stopped. After that, I was transferred to a different division, and I worked other cases, and eventually I left for my wife. And somewhere in all of it, I stopped thinking about 2012 and started thinking about what was in front of me. And then what was in front of you was a $50 million contract with a shell company connected to the same network. Yeah, he said. So, here we are, Sha. Paused some. Rosario called on Friday afternoon. Ethan was picking Noah up from school when the call came through. He answered with one hand, waving at the teacher holding the door with the other, and waited while Noah took approximately 400 years to put on his jacket. I've got something, Rosario said, without preamble. Hold on. He pointed at the car. Noah started toward it. Okay, talk. The 2012 working documents include a wire transfer record from a Blue Water Capital subsidiary to an account held by a BVI entity. Account number I'm going to text you. The account holder at the time was listed only as a nominee directorship. Standard BVI anonymity structure. She paused. I ran the nominee through the archived registry. The directorship was held by a firm called Peregrine Administrative Services. Peregrine's own registration lists its beneficial service agreement holder as, are you ready for this? Calder and Frome. Great Bay's registered agent. Same firm, same Tortola office. The 2012 account and Great Bay Holdings both ran through Peregrine Administrative Services via Calder and Frome. It's not a smoking gun. Nominee directorships use the same administrative firms all the time, but the account number. The account number, she said, appears in one other place in our working documents, in a list of counterparty accounts flagged during the Blue Water Capital Review. The list was attached to a voluntary disclosure submitted by Sterling Meridian's COO's office in November 2012, 1 month before the case was closed. The disclosure was presented as evidence of company cooperation. It listed accounts the company claimed to have identified as suspicious. Noah had climbed into the back seat. Ethan stood outside the car. He disclosed his own account, he said, as a suspicious account, as one of many, buried in a long list. Standard strategy for contaminating a lead. You hand investigators your own fingerprints as part of a pile of fingerprints, and they can't distinguish signal from noise, especially when the case is already under resource pressure. And then the case closed. 2 weeks later, Rosario let that sit. Callaway. The account still exists. BVI accounts don't automatically dissolve. They continue as long as the nominee structure is maintained. If that account has received wire transfers from Sterling Meridian vendor payments in the last decade, we have a direct evidentiary link between Hargrove and Great Bay Holdings. How do we get the transfer records? That's the part I can't do from the archive, she said. That requires a formal request, which requires a case, which requires someone to officially open one. You're saying we need to bring this to your superiors. I'm saying we need to bring this to the right person. My current supervisor is, let's say, cautious. There's an attorney in the financial fraud division named Okafor. He's been there 5 years, he's not tied to anyone from 2012, and he owes me a conversation. She paused. I need your full file. Everything you and Sterling have put together. I need it to be airtight enough that when Okafor reads it, he can't look away. How long do we have? I don't know, but Hargrove is going to realize something's wrong before long. He's already applying pressure on the deal. When Isabella keeps saying no without a reason he can argue with, he's going to start asking why. And when he starts asking why, he'll know to cover himself. Or worse, she said, move assets. Isabella met Ethan at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the Sterling Meridian building that Saturday morning. Neutral ground, neither of their regular spots. She was already there when he arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cup she'd barely touched, wearing a gray sweater that made her look slightly less like a CEO and slightly more like a person. He sat down across from her and told her everything Rosario had found. She listened without interrupting, which he'd come to expect from her. She had a way of processing information that was compact and efficient. Nothing wasted on visible reaction while the information was still coming in, all the weight arriving at the end. When he finished, she wrapped both hands around her cup. He turned over his own account, she said, to close the investigation. Yes. And my father didn't know. Your father's lawyer brokered a cooperation agreement without the company reviewing every document in the disclosure package. It happens in complex cases. There's too much paper for the principals to read everything. You trust the people handling it. He paused. In this case, the person handling it had a significant interest in what got disclosed and what got buried. She was quiet for a moment. If the account still exists, she said, and if it received vendor payments from my company, payments that Hargrove authorized, then we have him. We have a strong case. Rosario's contact in financial fraud can take it to a formal investigation. From there, subpoenas, banking records, the whole mechanism of an actual federal case. And my company? Cooperating witness status, most likely. The company is the victim in this. You aren't exposed as long as you haven't knowingly. I haven't. I know. He held her gaze for a second. But I want to say it clearly. There will be scrutiny on the company during any federal investigation. There will be press. There will be a period where the story is uncertain and your investors and your board won't know how to react. She nodded slowly. I've rebuilt this company once from nothing, she said. I can handle scrutiny. I know you can. I know. She looked at him. You're being careful with me. I appreciate it, but don't be so careful you forget to be direct. She set her cup down. What do we need to do? He'd already organized the answer to this question, which she'd probably guessed. We need to compile everything into a single, sequenced file. Your internal records, the 2016 vendor authorization document, the payment history, the timeline I've built, Rosario's findings from the 2012 working documents. I need to write a summary memo that connects all of it in plain language. Not legal language, just clear and sequential, so that someone reading it cold can understand the full scope in one read. He paused. That memo needs to be airtight. No hedging on the facts we know for certain. Clear notation on the parts that are still circumstantial. If Okafor reads it and finds one sloppy argument, it gives him a reason to set it aside. How long will it take you to write it? I can have a draft by Tuesday. I'll review it before you send it. 2 sets of eyes. She said it practically, not as a question. That works. They sat for a moment. Through the coffee shop window, a Saturday morning was happening on the street outside. People walking dogs, a kid on a scooter, a delivery truck double parked, and someone arguing with the driver about it. Normal city noise. The world running on its ordinary schedule. My father asked me about you, Isabella said. He looked up. What did he ask? Who you were, where you came from, why you were the one who found this when nobody else did. She tilted her head slightly. I told him about the federal background. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, make sure he knows what he's getting into. What did you tell him? That it was too late for that you'd been in it since Thursday morning when you tore the contract. A brief dry expression that was close to a smile. He said, then make sure you don't let him carry it alone. Ethan looked at the table. Your father's a decent man, he said. He is. She picked up her cup again. He spent 12 years thinking he failed his company, that he was complicit in something he didn't understand. He stepped aside and let someone else take the wheel, and the car drove off a cliff. She paused. If we prove what we think we can prove, that changes. Not the 12 years, but what they mean. I know. Is that enough reason to take on what Rosario's describing? Federal investigation, press coverage, scrutiny on the company. Isabella. He said her name in the way she'd said his, without planning to. I've been carrying what happened in 2012 for a long time. The closed case, the evidence that went nowhere. That's not your father's burden alone. He looked at her directly. So yes, it's enough reason, more than enough. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the specific nod of someone closing a decision. Tuesday then, she said. Send me the draft when it's ready. He worked through this weekend. Saturday night after Noah was asleep, Sunday morning before Noah was awake, Sunday afternoon while Noah watched a movie in the next room and came in twice to show him Lego updates. He wrote and rewrote the opening summary until it was clear without being reductive, factual without being dry, structured in a way that built the case with the logic of a river, one thing flowing into the next. The memo was 22 pages when he finished it on Monday evening. He read it through 3 times. He looked for soft spots, places where the argument leaned on inference rather than evidence, places where a skeptical reader could find a foothold for doubt. He tightened those. He added footnotes to the documents that supported each claim. Then he sent it to Isabella at 11:15 at night. She responded at 1 in the morning with 2 pages of comments, mostly small, 3 significant ones, all of them correct. She'd caught a place where he'd overstated the connection between 2 entities, a timeline error in Section 4, and a sentence in the conclusion that she said read as prosecutorial rather than evidentiary, which was accurate and which he fixed immediately. He sent her the revised version at 2:30 a.m. She sent back one word, good. He closed the laptop and sat in the quiet kitchen for a while. The window gap let in the cold. He could hear the distant sound of a freight train somewhere across the neighborhood, the long horn of it fading as it passed. He thought about Gerald Hargrove, who was probably sleeping soundly right now in whatever house he lived in, who had spent 15 years building something patient and elaborate and nearly invisible, who had walked into a room full of board members on Thursday morning with the pleasant confidence of a man who knew exactly how the day was going to go. He thought about how that kind of confidence felt from the inside. He thought about how it felt when it started to come apart. On Tuesday, he sent the file to Rosario, who forwarded it to Okafor in the Financial Fraud Division by noon. Okafor called Rosario by 4. Rosario called Ethan at 4:30. He read it, she said. And? A pause that lasted long enough to make him tighten his grip on the phone. He called it the cleanest preliminary case file he'd seen in 3 years, she said. He's opening a formal inquiry. Ethan let out a breath he'd been holding since Thursday morning. How long until they can move, he said. These things take time, but Okafor is pushing for expedited subpoenas on the BVY account records. If those come back with what we think they'll show, she paused. He said 2 weeks, maybe 3. He wants to time the move carefully, make sure Hargrove doesn't have warning. He'll need Isabella's cooperation. He wants to meet with her, Thursday, his office. I'll tell her. Calloway. Her voice changed slightly. You did good work here. Clean, organized, nothing sloppy, the way you used to do it. He didn't say anything for a moment. Rosario. The 2012 case, the account in the disclosure package, Hargrove's own account. Did your team flag it at the time? A pause. We flagged it, she said carefully. It was on a list for follow-up. But the case closed before the follow-up happened. Yes. So he knew exactly when to pull the trigger, Ethan said. He knew how much time he had. Someone knew, she said. Someone with visibility into the investigation's timeline. He thought about that. Someone who would have been briefed on the investigation's progress, he said, as part of the voluntary cooperation process. Yes. He sat with that for a long moment. We'll see what the subpoenas turn up, he said. We will, Rosario agreed. Thursday. Tell your client. He called Isabella immediately. She answered on the second ring, which told him she'd been waiting. Thursday, he said. Federal Building, Okafor's office. He's opening the case. The silence on her end was different from the silences he'd cataloged over the past week. It was the silence of someone standing at the edge of something irreversible, feeling the weight of it before stepping forward. I'll be there, she said. You sure you're ready for this? No, she said, which was honest. But I was never going to be ready. Might as well be now. He thought that was probably the most accurate description of how most important decisions actually got made, not from readiness, but from the point at which waiting stopped being an option. I'll pick you up at 8, he said. I can drive myself. I know, I'll pick you up at 8. Another pause, then, okay? Outside his window, the October night was doing what October nights did, getting colder, settling in, the smell of leaves and something burning somewhere distant, the kind of air that had teeth. He could hear the pipes in the walls complaining again, and somewhere on Magnolia Street the dog was barking at nothing, and upstairs his son was sleeping with his arm thrown over his head and the comforter pulled sideways and everything exactly the way it always was. The world kept running its ordinary schedule. It had no idea what was about to happen inside it. Okafor's office was on the 6th floor of the Federal Building on Broad Street, a room that had all the warmth of a filing cabinet and approximately the same amount of natural light. 2 small windows looked out at a brick wall. The fluorescent overhead flickered every 40 seconds or so, which Ethan noticed because he'd always been the kind of person who noticed things like that, and it had never once been useful. Special Agent Marcus Okafor was 38, compact and precise in the way of someone who had learned early that being underestimated was its own kind of advantage. He shook Isabella's hand first, then Ethan's, and gestured them toward chairs that had clearly been chosen by someone with no interest in comfort as a concept. I've read your file 3 times, he said, sitting across from them. He had the memo open on his desk, his own handwriting in the margins. Small, dense, different color ink for different categories of notation. I want to say first that the organization is good. Clean sourcing, clear notation on what's established versus what's circumstantial. That made it easier to evaluate. He looked at Ethan. You have a federal background. Financial crimes. 6 years. I left in 2019. Rosario's unit? The last 2 years, yes. Okafor nodded once and filed that away. Then he looked at Isabella. Miss Sterling, I need to understand something before we go further. You've been running this company for 5 years. The vendor authorization that placed Great Bay Holdings on your approved list, you signed off on the 2016 board resolution that gave Hargrove the authority to approve that list. I signed the resolution. I didn't review every vendor on the list it authorized. You trusted him. Yes. Her voice was flat, not defensive, just accurate. I trusted him. Were there any prior occasions where you questioned his financial decisions? Any flags that, in retrospect, if I'd seen a flag, I would have acted on it? She met Okafor's gaze directly. I understand what you're asking. You want to know if I was negligent or complicit. I was neither. I ran a $2 billion company, and I had a COO I trusted to manage operational decisions within the parameters the board established. That's how organizations function. She paused. If you want to spend time on that question, we can. But I'd rather spend time on what you actually found. Okafor studied her for a moment. Not hostile. More like calibrating. The BVI account, he said. The one that appears in the 2012 working documents. We submitted an expedited request to our mutual legal assistance liaison for the account records. He opened a second folder. Banking secrecy in the British Virgin Islands is significant, but not absolute. We have a treaty relationship that allows for records requests when there's a credible federal case. The request was granted. He looked at them both. The account received wire transfers from Sterling Meridian vendor accounts in 17 separate transactions between 2016 and 2022. Total amount transferred, said $4.3 million. The number landed in the room. Isabella didn't move. Ethan watched her and watched Okafor in the same glance. Both of them still, the specific stillness of people absorbing something real. 4 million, Isabella said. 4.3, over 6 years. Amounts consistent with the below-threshold transfer pattern identified in Mr. Calloway's memo. Okafor closed the folder. The account's current beneficial owner is listed through the nominee directorship as Peregrine Administrative Services. However, as part of our treaty request, we also asked for any Know Your Customer documentation the originating bank held for the beneficial service agreement. They provided it. He looked at them. The actual beneficial owner is listed as Gerald Allen Hargrove, home address on file, a property in Sullivan's Island. Ethan had suspected this. He'd been confident enough that he'd built the memo around the likelihood of it. But there was a difference between suspecting something and having a federal agent read you a beneficial owner's name off a banking document, and the difference was the kind that made the back of your neck prickle. Across from him, Isabella had gone very still. He put his own name on it, she said. It came out slightly different from how she'd intended it, he could tell. Not quite the measured tone she usually managed. He didn't even bother to hide it at the account level. BVI banking secrecy is robust, Okafor said. He likely calculated that no one would ever access those records without a federal case, and that a federal case would never be opened because the 2012 investigation had already been closed. He paused. He wasn't wrong about the logic. He just didn't account for someone reading the fine print on a $50 million contract. He looked at Ethan when he said it. Ethan didn't respond to the look. He was doing what he always did at moments like this, thinking ahead, mapping the next move, not letting himself feel the weight of the moment until there was time to feel it safely. What happens now? He said. We've already drafted a formal indictment referral, Okafor said. Wire fraud, 17 counts. Breach of fiduciary duty, that's civil, but we'll coordinate with Ms. Sterling's legal team on that front. Possible RICO exposure depending on the network. We're still mapping the full scope. He looked at Isabella. We also want to examine whether anyone else in your organization had knowledge of or facilitated the transfers. Specifically, the legal team, Isabella said, and the finance department. Yes, that's not an accusation. It's standard scope. I understand. I'll provide full access. She was back to the contained, precise version of herself. Whatever had moved across her face at the mention of Hargrove's name had been packed back away. What about the Coastal Meridian deal? The other side of it? The executives who flew in for the signing? Are they... We're examining that separately. Coastal Meridian Partners and its principals are under a parallel review. We'll know more in the next week. He turned a page. Now, there's a timing issue I want to discuss with you both. He explained it carefully. The indictment referral would go to a federal grand jury for review. That process typically took several weeks, but given the quality of the evidence and the federal wire fraud statutes involved, Okafor expected a faster track. The problem was that Hargrove was still inside the company, still had access to the records, still had authority over a range of operational decisions. The moment he knows he's under investigation, or suspects it, he may attempt to move assets, destroy records, or alert co-conspirators, Okafor said. We need to manage the timing of any action against him carefully. What kind of action? Isabella asked. Arrest, Okafor said. He said it simply, without theater. We want to time it so that when we move, we have everything we need and he has no warning, which means, Ms. Sterling, that you'll need to continue operating as though nothing has changed for approximately 2 more weeks. Isabella was quiet for a moment. 2 weeks, she said. Possibly less if the grand jury moves quickly, but yes. She looked at the flickering fluorescent light, then back at Okafor. He's going to keep pushing me on the Coastal Meridian deal. We know. We'd ask you to continue deflecting without rejecting it entirely. The deal being on the table keeps him confident. It's the thing he's been working toward for, we believe, at least 3 years. As long as he thinks it might still close, he has a reason to sit still. You want me to keep him comfortable, she said. Yes. While I know he spent 15 years stealing from my company and helping destroy my father. Yes. Okafor held her gaze. I understand that's... I'll do it, she said. Not easily, but immediately. What else? They left the federal building at 11:15 and stood on the sidewalk on Broad Street in the thin October sunlight. It was cold enough that their breath showed, and Ethan's car was half a block down, and neither of them moved toward it right away. 2 weeks, Isabella said. Could be less. Could be more. Could be, he agreed. She looked down the street. A few pedestrians, a city bus, the ordinary Wednesday morning moving past them with no awareness that anything particular had happened in the last 2 hours. 4.3 million, she said. 17 transactions. 6 years. Starting the year after he got Great Bay on the approved vendor list. And before that, the 2013 and 2014 payments I found. The pre-Great Bay transfers through Calder and Frome. She shook her head slightly. He was siphoning money before he even had the formal structure set up, before Great Bay existed. He was always doing this, Ethan said. From the beginning, the Coastal Meridian deal was going to be the major extraction, the big move before a long retirement. Everything else was preparation. She turned to look at him. How do people do that? Spend 15 years inside something, building it, working inside it every day, watching it grow, while simultaneously hollowing it out? Compartmentalization, he said. They separate the person who goes to the office and shakes hands and mentors people and comes to the holiday party. They separate that person from the other thing. Most of the time, it's not even conscious. They stop seeing the contradiction. Do you believe that? He thought about it honestly. I believe it's possible. I don't know if it applies to Hargrove specifically. Some people are just, they see an opportunity and they take it, and they don't experience much dissonance because they don't assign the same moral weight to other people's money that they assign to their own. That's worse, somehow. Yeah, he said. It is. They walked to the car. He unlocked it. She got in the passenger side without the slight hesitation of someone who was used to sitting in the back of other people's cars, which he noticed. He drove. She was quiet, looking out the window. He let the quiet exist for a while. He'd learned that she processed things in stages and that the first stage often didn't involve talking. After a few minutes, she said, "He was kind to me early on when I was rebuilding. He was one of the people who made me feel like I wasn't crazy for thinking it could work. He'd come into my office and sit down and talk through the strategy, and he'd say things like, "This is exactly the right move," and "Your father built something worth saving. Let's save it." She stopped. I used to think of it as loyalty. Now I understand it was investment. I was the vehicle. Keep the vehicle running. "I'm sorry," Ethan said. "Don't be sorry about it. She pressed her fingers against the car window. "I keep thinking about all the decisions I made that he had a hand in. Board resolutions he helped draft, deals he helped structure. For years I thought I was building something, but some percentage of what I was building his exit, and I had no idea. Isabella," he kept his eyes on the road, "you rebuilt a dead company into something worth $2 billion. You did that. He used your vehicle, but you built the vehicle. Those are separate things." She looked at him. "I know," she said, but it came out like something she was trying to make herself believe. He understood that. Some truths needed to be said out loud several times before they could be felt. 2 weeks passed in a way that felt nothing like 2 weeks. Ethan went back to his regular schedule: school drop-offs, client work, evenings at his desk. He stayed in contact with Rosario, who was feeding him updates from the grand jury process in the careful, oblique language of someone who was still technically operating outside her official capacity and didn't want that on record. He stayed in contact with Isabella, who sent brief messages every day or two, updates on Hargrove's behavior, on the company's operations, on the things she was noticing now that she couldn't unnotice. Hargrove was applying pressure, not dramatically. He wasn't the dramatic kind, but steadily. He came to Isabella twice in the first week with new versions of the Coastal Meridian argument, each one more financially specific than the last, each one framed as urgency rather than desire. He sent her a detailed cost analysis of the delay, prepared by someone in the finance department. He scheduled a call with the Coastal Meridian team just to keep the relationship warm, he said, which Isabella allowed while recording a memo of the conversation that went directly to Okafor's office. He was patient, Ethan kept thinking. 15 years had made him patient in a way that ordinary ambition doesn't produce. He'd sat inside this machine long enough to know its rhythms, its tolerances, its capacity to absorb pressure and bounce back. He knew how to apply force in ways that felt reasonable and professional and completely in the interest of the company he was actively stealing from. Ethan found himself, during those 2 weeks, thinking about Hargrove in a way he hadn't expected. Not with sympathy, nothing close to it, but with the specific attention you give to something that has impressed you against your will, the craftsmanship of it, terrible as it was. The precision of the structure, the patience. He'd seen fraud before. He'd spent 6 years looking at it. Most financial fraud was relatively simple, someone with access and appetite who moved money and hoped no one would look carefully enough to see it move. Simple, direct, sloppy at the edges. This was different. Hargrove had built a parallel structure over 15 years that sat inside the company like an organ, functioning, connected to the whole, invisible until you cut into the specific place where it wasn't supposed to be. It had required him to understand the company as well as anyone who'd ever worked there, to know which decisions would draw attention and which would disappear into the normal noise of corporate operations, to build his authority carefully so that each expansion seemed reasonable given the one before it. It was a long game played by someone with an exceptionally low tolerance for losing. That was the part that worried Ethan during those 2 weeks. Not that Hargrove would figure out what was happening. Okafor's team had been careful, and Isabella had been extraordinary, and there'd been no detectable change in the company's normal operations. But that a man who had been patient enough to build this, who had been careful enough to survive this long, who had been smart enough to close a federal investigation by burying his own account in the cooperation documents, that kind of man had contingencies. He raised this with Rosario 10 days in. "He'll have thought about what happens if it goes wrong," Ethan said. "He's too careful not to have. Does Okafor know what the contingencies might look like?" "They're watching the BVI account," Rosario said. "Any movement will trip the monitoring. We also have his travel documents flagged. If he books international travel, we know immediately. Domestic travel? That's harder. He has the Sullivan's Island property. What else? We're looking into it." She paused. Calloway. We're not in the business of waiting for things to go wrong. The grand jury moves Friday. If the indictment comes back, which Okafor expects it will, we move on Monday. He was quiet for a moment. What time Monday? Early. We don't give him the workday to realize anything's happened. Isabella needs to know the timeline. Okafor will call her directly, but yes, keep her ready. Trust her. He called Isabella that night. It was late, past 10, and Noah had been asleep for an hour. The house was quiet in the way it got after the kid noise stopped. Not empty exactly, just settled back into itself. She answered on the first ring. Friday, he said. Grand jury. Monday, if it goes the way Okafor thinks. A pause. Monday? Early morning, before the workday. You'll need to be in the building. I'll be there. Another pause. Where will you be? I don't have an official role in the arrest, he said. I'm not federal anymore. I'll be wherever you need me, I suppose. She was quiet for a moment. The boardroom, she said. I want to present everything to the board that morning, before the press knows anything, before anyone in the company hears it from somewhere else. I want to be the one who tells them what happened and what we're going to do next. She paused. Will you be there? In the building? Yes. Thank you. He almost said it was nothing. He stopped himself because it wasn't nothing. It was the opposite of nothing. It was 2 weeks of work and several years of prior history, and a decision to put himself back into the current of something he'd stepped out of in 2019 for very good reasons. And the correct response to someone thanking you for that was not to minimize it. You're going to do fine, he said instead. Monday morning, you're going to walk in there and you're going to lay it all out, and they're going to follow you, because that's what you do. You don't know that. I've watched you read 600 pages of financial records at 11 o'clock at night without complaining. I have a reasonable confidence level. There was a sound on her end that was almost a laugh. Almost. Get some sleep, he said. You too. Neither of them managed it particularly well that weekend. Monday morning arrived with the specific flatness of days that are going to become memorable. No drama in the atmosphere, no weather portent, just a cold, clear November morning that looked like any other November morning and had no intention of advertising itself. Ethan dropped Noah at school at 7:45. Noah had asked, getting out of the car, why his father was wearing a better shirt than usual. Meeting, Ethan said. Is it the important job? Yeah. Noah thought about this. Is it the one with the billionaire? The CEO. Yes. Noah nodded slowly with the air of a 7-year-old who understood that some things were above his security clearance but was willing to accept that on faith. Good luck, he said. Thanks, bud. He watched Noah run into the school, and then he drove to the Sterling Meridian building. Okafor's team was already in position when Ethan arrived at 8:15. 2 vehicles, unmarked, which meant nothing to anyone who didn't know what to look for but were obvious enough once you did. A plainclothes agent in the lobby, another near the elevator bank. Ethan had been given a contact number for Okafor and texted it when he came through the doors. He got a single word back. Ready. Isabella was in her office on 38. She was standing when he came in, which told him she'd been standing for a while. She sat when she was working, stood when she was waiting, and the difference between the two was something he'd cataloged without meaning to over the past 3 weeks. She was wearing a dark blazer and her hair was back the way it always was, and she looked exactly like herself, which under the circumstances he found oddly reassuring. There was no performance to this morning, no costume. She'd decided to be what she was. Board is convening at 9, she said. I told them it was a strategic update. Howard Briggs has been texting me since Friday, asking if it's about the Coastal Meridian deal. What did you tell him? I told him it was a comprehensive update and I'd explain everything in person. She looked at him. Gerald's already in the building. He came in at 7:30, which is earlier than usual. Rosario told me they saw him come in. He knows something's wrong, she said. Not specifically, but something. I could tell, watching him through the glass this morning. He's too deliberate. He moves differently when he's careful. Okafor knows. They'll move when the board meeting is done, not before. They don't want the arrest disrupting the presentation. She nodded. "How are you?" he said. She looked at him with the slight surprise she occasionally showed when someone asked her a question that was about her rather than about the situation. "Fine," she said, and then, because she was honest, "Not fine." Somewhere in the middle of those two things. "That's about right for this morning." She picked up her phone from the desk, then set it back down. "My father's coming at 10. He'll be in the lobby. He doesn't want to be in the building before Hargrove is—" She stopped. "He wants to be here after." "That makes sense. I told him he didn't have to come." "I know you did." "He said there are some things you have to see with your own eyes, or they don't become real." She looked at the window. "I think he spent 12 years not being sure whether to believe that his instincts were wrong, whether to believe that he was actually part of what they said he was part of somehow, whether his own judgment could be trusted." She paused. "Today he gets to find out that his judgment was right. He just put it in the wrong person." Ethan didn't say anything. Some things didn't need a response. She picked up her folder. The complete presentation, 64 pages, the accumulated work of 3 weeks in hard copy, and on her laptop, organized the way he'd taught her to organize it. And she looked at him one more time. "Ready?" she said. "Are you?" "No," she said, and walked out of the office. The board meeting started at 9 with 7 members present, including Howard Briggs, who took one look at Isabella's expression and stopped asking about Coastal Meridian. Hargrove was in the room. He sat in his usual seat, 2 down from Isabella's right, close enough to her end of the table that it signaled proximity to power. He had his laptop open and his coffee in front of him, and he looked exactly as he always looked, silver-haired, composed, the practiced ease of someone who had been in boardrooms long enough to feel at home in them. He looked at Ethan when Ethan came in and sat in a chair along the wall. Not at the table, just present in the room, out of the way. Something passed across Hargrove's face, something small and controlled, an assessment being updated. Ethan looked back at him steadily, not aggressively, not with the satisfaction of someone who had caught him, because that wasn't what this was, just steadily. Seeing him clearly, for the first time without the partial information that had preceded this morning. Hargrove looked away first. Isabella stood at the head of the table. She didn't open with anything preamble. She didn't thank people for coming or explain why she'd called the meeting or soften the entry point. She just started. "I'm going to tell you what I've found," she said, "and I'm going to show you the evidence. I'd ask everyone to let me finish before asking questions, because the full picture is what matters here, not any single piece of it." She connected her laptop to the display. The first slide was a timeline, 2011 to the present, clean, organized, the way Ethan had taught her, one thing flowing into the next. She talked for 40 minutes. She presented every document, every transfer record, every corporate approval, every shell company connection. She presented Okafor's findings on the BVY account. She presented the 17 wire transfers, the $4.3 million, the beneficial owner registration with Gerald Allen Hargrove's name and his Sullivan's Island address. She presented the 2012 federal investigation and the voluntary disclosure. She presented what her father had told her about who managed the cooperation process. She presented the pattern of Blue Water Capital, the dissolution, the Great Bay registration 1 year later, the same registered agent address. She did all of it in the precise, sequential, unemotional voice of someone who had decided that the truth didn't need help from her feelings to be devastating. The truth was enough on its own. She just had to carry it across the room. At some point in the first 10 minutes, Howard Briggs stopped looking skeptical and started looking pale. At some point in the second 10 minutes, 2 of the other board members had stopped taking notes and were just watching Isabella with an expression Ethan recognized. The expression of people realizing that the ground under something they trusted had been different from what they thought, and that the difference had been invisible for a very long time. Throughout all of it, Gerald Hargrove sat in his chair. He was still. Not dramatically still. Not the stillness of a man bracing for impact. More the stillness of someone who had made a calculation and was running through its implications in real time. His laptop was open. At one point he reached for his coffee cup and then didn't pick it up. He didn't interrupt. He didn't object. He didn't do anything that would draw more attention to him than Isabella's presentation was already drawing. He was still calculating, Ethan thought, even now, especially now. When Isabella reached the final slide, the formal notification that Sterling Meridian was cooperating with a federal investigation and that the board's immediate responsibilities were outlined in the attached legal brief from the company's outside counsel, she looked up from the presentation and looked directly at Hargrove. The room was very quiet. "Gerald," she said. Her voice had changed, just slightly. The flatness was still there, but underneath it was something else. Not anger and not grief either. Something that had been compressed into this one moment after weeks of carrying it. "I trusted you. My father trusted you. You used that trust to steal from us and to help destroy him, and you kept doing it for 15 years while sitting across from me at a table we both thought meant something." She paused. "I'm not going to ask you to explain yourself. I don't need you to. I just wanted to say that to your face." The room was completely silent. Hargrove looked at her. For a moment, the mask was gone. Not entirely. The man was too controlled for that. But the layer of practiced ease, the warmth, the professional confidence that had been calibrated for exactly these rooms, for exactly this kind of situation, it slipped. Just enough to show something underneath it that was harder to look at because it was more real. Then a door opened. Okafor came in with 2 other agents. They didn't rush. They didn't announce themselves dramatically. They walked to where Hargrove was sitting with the professional economy of people who had done this before and would do it again, and understood that the moment had its own gravity without any help from them. "Gerald Hargrove," Okafor said, "you're under arrest for federal wire fraud, 17 counts." He set a document on the table. "You have the right to remain silent." Hargrove stood. He straightened his jacket first. Actually straightened his jacket, smoothed the lapel, the automatic reflex of a man who had spent 61 years managing how he appeared to other people. Then he put his hands in front of him, not behind, and looked at Okafor. "I want my lawyer," he said. "Of course," Okafor said. They walked him out. No one in the room spoke, not immediately. The agents were efficient and quiet, and the door closed behind them with an ordinary click that was somehow the loudest sound in the room. Howard Briggs had both hands on the table. He was looking at the door, then at Isabella, then at the table again. His face had moved past pale into something older and more bewildered. 15 years, he said. To no one in particular. Just the number, out loud, trying to make it fit inside something comprehensible. Isabella was still standing at the head of the table. She had one hand resting on her laptop. The presentation was still on the screen behind her. The final slide, the notification of federal cooperation, looking back at the room with the blunt clarity of a thing that was already in motion and could not be reversed. She looked around the table, at every board member one by one. "I know this is a great deal to process," she said. Her voice was steady. "I also know that in the next 24 hours there will be questions from investors, from the press, from our employees. I want to tell you what I've already decided. We cooperate fully with the federal investigation. We open our records completely. We bring in outside counsel to review the full scope of the vendor relationships and fund transfers. We are transparent with our investors, and we rebuild." She paused. "This company has been rebuilt before from worse. I know how to do it. I need to know the board is with me." Silence. Then one of the other board members, a woman named Carol Delaney, who was usually the quietest person in any given room, said, "I'm with you." One by one, the others followed. Howard Briggs last, but he followed. "Thank you," Isabella said. She meant it without ceremony. Ethan was still in his chair along the wall. She hadn't looked at him since the agents had come in. Now she did, briefly, and there was something in her expression that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite exhaustion and wasn't quite the kind of feeling that comes after you've done something important, but was some combination of all three, arriving all at once in a room where the worst of it was finally done. He gave her a slight nod. She looked back at the board. "Let's talk about what we're going to tell the company," she said. Richard Sterling arrived at 10:15. Ethan was in the lobby waiting for the elevator when the older man came through the glass doors, and they looked at each other for a moment before either of them spoke. Richard was wearing a coat that was slightly too large for him in the way of men who had lost weight gradually without buying new clothes, and he moved with the particular carefulness of someone who had learned at 63 that the world was more fragile than he'd once believed. "Is it done?" Richard asked. He was arrested about 40 minutes ago, Ethan said. Your daughter is with the board. Richard nodded slowly. His jaw moved slightly, like he was processing something through his teeth. You're the one who found it, he said. It wasn't a question. I found the first thread, Ethan said. Your daughter pulled most of it. She called me after your boardroom presentation, Richard said. 3 weeks ago. She told me a compliance reviewer had torn up a $50 million contract. He looked at Ethan carefully. She said he reminded her of the kind of person who couldn't find something that mattered and stay quiet about it. That's one way to put it. It's the way she put it. Richard was quiet for a moment. I told her not to dig into this. Years ago. I told her to leave it alone. I know. She didn't listen. No, Ethan said. She didn't. Richard Sterling looked at the lobby floor, at the abstract sculpture, at the elevator bank. His expression had the specific quality of a man who was recalibrating something fundamental about the years behind him, not erasing them, because you can't erase time, but assigning them different meaning. Understanding that what he had experienced as his own failure had been, at least partly, a crime committed against him by someone he trusted. That was a difficult thing to absorb. It didn't come clean. Is she okay? He said. She will be, Ethan said. And then, because it was true. She's remarkable. Richard looked at him. Something in his expression shifted slightly. Yes, he said. She is. The elevator came. They rode up together in the quiet of men who didn't have much else to say and didn't need to fill the space. The doors opened on 38. Isabella was in the hall, walking toward them. The board meeting apparently concluded. She saw her father, and for a moment the CEO disappeared entirely. Just a daughter in a hallway, looking at a man she'd been fighting for 12 years without ever telling him that was what she was doing. Richard opened his arms. She walked into them. Ethan stepped out of the elevator and moved to give them the hall. He went to the window at the end of the corridor, the one that looked out toward the harbor, and he stood there with his hands in his pockets and looked at the water while behind him something private and necessary was happening between two people who had needed this morning to arrive for a very long time. The harbor was cold and silver in the November light. A container ship was moving slowly through the channel, distant enough that it looked almost still, just the fact of its movement detectable if you watched long enough. His phone buzzed, a text from Noah's school. Hi, Mr. Calloway. Just confirming that pickup today is at 3:30. He typed back, confirmed, I'll be there. He looked at the water for another moment. Then he turned around and walked back toward the rest of the day. The press found out by noon. Not because anyone at Sterling Meridian leaked it. Isabella had been meticulous about that, briefing her communications team within an hour of the board meeting with a prepared statement and strict instructions about who spoke to whom and when. But federal arrests don't stay quiet, and Gerald Hargrove had been a visible enough figure in Charleston's business community that someone at the courthouse or in the parking garage or walking past the right window at the right moment had seen something and made a call. By 12:30, 3 financial news outlets had posted brief items about an arrest at Sterling Meridian Capital. By 2 o'clock, the story had a full name and a charge count. By 3, it was on the local television news with a chyron that said Sterling Meridian COO arrested, federal wire fraud, and a file photo of Hargrove from a business conference 2 years ago, smiling at something off camera with the comfortable ease of a man who had every reason to feel good about how things were going. Isabella watched approximately 4 minutes of the coverage from her office and then turned it off and went back to work. There was a great deal of work to go back to. The investor calls started at 1. She did 6 of them in 3 hours, back to back, each one a version of the same conversation. Controlled disclosure, factual summary, forward-looking language about cooperation and recovery, and the steps already taken. She was calm on every call. Not performing calm, actually calm, in the way that sometimes happens when the worst thing you've been dreading finally arrives and you realize you can handle it, that the dread was larger than the thing itself. After the 6th call, she sat in her office for 10 minutes without doing anything, just sat. Her phone was on the desk and it was buzzing regularly, and she looked at it without picking it up. Ethan knocked on the open door. How bad? He said. 2 investors want to pause their positions pending the investigation. 3 are holding. One called to say he thought I handled the board presentation with integrity and he's increasing his stake. She looked at the phone. So? Mixed. That's better than I expected, honestly. Me too. She picked up the phone, looked at the screen, set it back down. The Coastal Meridian team released a statement. They're claiming they had no knowledge of Great Bay Holdings' connection to Hargrove. Their lawyers are very emphatic about that. What does Okafor think? He thinks they're probably lying, but he needs more time to prove it. She leaned back in her chair. The two executives who were in the boardroom that morning, the ones who flew in for the signing, he's talking to them. Ethan nodded. He leaned against the doorframe. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the kind that needs time and stillness and the gradual return of normal life. She probably looked the same. Your father went home? He said. About an hour ago. He wanted to stay, but he had a doctor's appointment he'd been putting off for 2 months, and I made him go. She paused. He was very quiet this morning, after. Not sad exactly. More like someone who'd been holding their breath for 12 years and finally exhaled, and now they have to figure out how to breathe normally again. That takes a while. I know. She looked at the window. The harbor was doing what it always did, which was exist with complete indifference to everything happening around it. She'd found that comforting lately. He asked about you again, by the way. Your father? He asked what you were going to do next, whether you were going back to independent consulting. That's the plan, Ethan said. I have other clients, cases that have been waiting. He said you should have a bigger platform than that. Ethan made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. With respect to your father, I have a 7-year-old and a house with a broken window and approximately zero interest in a bigger platform. I told him that. She looked at him directly. I also told him that some people are most useful when they're operating in the spaces no one else is looking at, that the value of what you do isn't diminished by the scale of it. He was quiet for a moment. That's generous. It's accurate. She picked up a pen, turned it in her fingers. I'm going to need to hire a new COO. I know. It's going to take time to do it right. I'm not going to rush it. She looked at the pen. I've been thinking about what I want in that role, what I should have been looking for from the beginning. She paused. Competence is easy to find. Loyalty is a word people use freely and mean rarely. What I actually want is someone who will tell me when I'm wrong, who will find the problem before it becomes a disaster, and say so even when saying so is uncomfortable. He understood what direction this was going. Isabella, I'm not asking you to be my COO, she said. I know that's not who you are or what you want. I'm just telling you what I've been thinking about. She looked at him steadily. I'm going to ask if you'd be willing to consult. Formally. A retainer. Compliance review on any significant transaction before it moves forward. Your terms. That's a real role. I know it is. I'm offering it seriously. She let the pen rest on the desk. You found something that 5 other people with better credentials and larger offices missed. I'd be not very smart if I let that walk out the door and didn't try to keep some version of it available. He looked at her. He thought about his current workload, which was manageable, his current income, which was also manageable, but only just. Noah's school tuition next year, which was going to require a careful conversation with his bank account. The broken window. The cabinet door in the kitchen that still hung at an angle and still made him think of Sarah without warning. I'd need to be able to say no to specific assignments, he said, if something conflicts with other clients or with Noah's schedule. Of course. And I work from home unless there's a specific reason to be here. Fine. And I'm not attending board meetings as a regular thing. I'm a consultant. I'm not management. Agreed. He looked at her for another moment. Okay, he said. Something in her expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a small adjustment. The particular relief of someone who had asked for something they actually needed and gotten a yes. Okay, she said. He shouted. The federal case moved faster than Ethan had expected, which Rosario told him later was partly due to the quality of the evidence file and partly due to the fact that Okafor was the kind of prosecutor who treated a case like a personal commitment rather than a workload item. Gerald Hargrove was held on a $2 million bond that he made within 48 hours, which told you something about the money he'd managed to keep outside the accounts they'd identified. He was released with his passport surrendered and a monitoring condition, and his lawyer gave a statement to the press that used the word alleged 11 times in 4 sentences, which was a record that Ethan did not find impressive. The BVI account records came back fully in the 3rd week of November. They confirmed 17 transfers from Sterling Meridian vendor accounts between 2016 and 2022, as Okafor had said. They also confirmed something no one had found yet in the initial investigation, a series of outbound transfers from the BVI account to a second account, this one held in Singapore under a different nominee structure. The Singapore account had received just under $800,000 over 4 years. When Okafor's team traced the Singapore account's beneficial ownership, they found a name that connected, not to Hargrove directly, but to the Coastal Meridian Partners corporate structure, specifically to one of the 2 executives who had flown in for the signing ceremony and sat in Isabella's boardroom on the morning Ethan tore the contract. That changed the shape of the case considerably. What had looked like Hargrove operating a solo extraction became, with the Singapore connection, the outline of a coordinated network. Hargrove on the inside, building the vehicle and the authority and the cover over 15 years, and the Coastal Meridian principals on the outside, ready to receive the major payout once the $50 million deal closed. The network had been patient enough to wait for Isabella Sterling to rebuild the company to a value that made the extraction worthwhile, and then to structure a deal that would have moved the money in a way that was difficult but not impossible to trace. They needed her to succeed, Rosario told Ethan when the Singapore connection became clear. They needed the company to be worth something. Hargrove kept the machine running, and the money they siphoned along the way was maintenance costs. The real score was the deal. And he would have walked away clean, Ethan said. Retired, stayed on the board as an independent director maybe. Respectable exit. Instead, he's looking at a federal indictment with a RICO count attached. She paused. You know he's going to flip. Lawyer like the one he hired doesn't take a case like this to trial. He's building toward cooperation, which means the Coastal Meridian principals are going to have a bad new year. Very bad, Rosario said. Okafor is already in conversations with the Singapore Financial Authority about the second account. Ethan sat with that for a moment. He thought about the morning in the boardroom, 6 weeks ago now, when he'd stood at the front of that room and watched 11 people look at him the way people look at something they've already decided to dismiss. He thought about the specific calculation he'd made, somewhere around minute 40 of his presentation, that the only thing left to do was the thing no one expected. He thought about how much can hinge on a single act of stubbornness in exactly the right moment. December came in cold and fast. Noah's soccer season ended the first weekend of the month, with his team finishing 3rd in their age bracket, which Noah considered a personal injustice, but eventually made peace with when his coach took the whole team out for ice cream and told them they'd improved more than any group he'd coached in 5 years. Noah came home with ice cream on his jacket and a certificate of participation and the specific glow of a kid who has been told by a trusted adult that he did good. Ethan stuck the certificate to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a crab that they'd bought at a gas station in Savannah 2 summers ago. He stood and looked at it for a moment and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that parenthood was largely the act of noticing small things and deciding they mattered, which was perhaps the most important skill a person could have and the one most consistently undervalued by people who didn't do it. He was in the kitchen making breakfast on a Saturday morning when Isabella called. Noah was at the table with a bowl of cereal and a library book about deep-sea creatures, and had been explaining unprompted why anglerfish were objectively the most interesting animal on Earth. Ethan answered. The plea agreement, she said without preamble. Okafor just told me. Hargrove's lawyer filed the cooperation framework last night. He's pleading to 7 counts in exchange for full disclosure on the network. 7 counts, Ethan said, out of 17. Okafor wasn't happy about the number, but the network information, the full picture of who knew what and when, was worth it to him. Hargrove is going to testify against the Coastal Meridian principles. She paused. He's also going to provide a full account of what happened in 2012, the voluntary disclosure, the buried evidence, the decision to close the investigation. Ethan was quiet. That means the record changes, she said. What happened to my father, officially? The way the case was handled, the way the investigation was closed. It's going to be part of Hargrove's testimony under oath in a federal proceeding. Her voice was careful, the way it got when she was holding something close. My father's lawyer is already talking to Okafor's office about what that means for my father's official record. It means it gets corrected, Ethan said. Yes. A breath. It means it gets corrected. He leaned against the counter. Noah had looked up from his book at the tone of the conversation and was watching him with the frank attention of a child who doesn't pretend not to be paying attention. Is he okay? Ethan said. Your father. I called him this morning. He didn't say much. He was quiet. And then he said, Bella, I always knew I didn't do what they said I did. But there's a difference between knowing it yourself and having it in a document. And then he said he needed to take his walk and he'd call me back. Did he call back? 20 minutes later, he'd walked to the park near his house and sat on a bench by the water for a while. She paused. He said the water was cold, but the sun was good. Ethan looked at his own window, the gap at the bottom where the cold came through. He'd fixed it 2 weeks ago, finally. Noah had pointed out that the draft was making his room cold, and that had been, apparently, the specific motivation required that 12 months of personal intention had not produced. How are you? He said. Busy? The outside counsel review is taking longer than expected. There's more in the historical records than we initially thought, and we're being thorough. 2 of the subsidiary relationships that Hargrove managed are going to need full restructuring. She paused. The investor who increased his stake told 3 other people, and 2 of them called me this week, so that's moving in the right direction. That's not what I asked. A brief silence. I know, she said. She stopped. I'm okay. I keep having moments where I'll be in the middle of something completely ordinary, and I'll think about the length of it. 15 years. The board meetings and the strategy sessions and the dinners where I sat across from him and told him things I was proud of, and he sat there and... She stopped again. I don't know what to do with that practically. I don't have a category for it. You don't need a category, so, he said. You just need to let it be the size it actually is instead of trying to make it smaller so it's easier to carry. She was quiet for a moment. That's surprisingly useful advice, she said. I have my moments. You do. He could hear something shift in her voice, towards something lighter, more like herself when she wasn't performing competence. Noah good? Currently reading about anglerfish and advocating for them with significant conviction. Tell him I said the space station is still safe. I checked on it last week. He looked at Noah, who had not stopped watching him. She says the space station is safe. Noah's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. She still has it? I still have it, Isabella's voice came through the phone, loud enough for Noah to hear. It's been like 6 weeks, Noah said. You built it. It's worth keeping. Noah looked at this information with the serious consideration of someone who was deciding whether to be flattered or just satisfied. He decided on satisfied. Okay, he said, and went back to the anglerfish. Isabella laughed. It was a real laugh, short, unguarded, the kind that doesn't wait for permission. He hadn't heard her laugh like that before. He found that he was glad to hear it. I'll let you have breakfast, she said. I'll be in Tuesday if you need me before then. I know, thank you, Ethan. She said his name naturally, without the slight self-consciousness that had characterized the first few times she'd used it. It was just his name now. Take care of yourself, he said. Working on it, she said, and hung up. The formal restoration of Richard Sterling's reputation came in the second week of January, on a Tuesday that was cold and gray and looked nothing like a day that should be significant but was. Hargrove's cooperation testimony was entered into the federal record. His account of the 2012 voluntary disclosure, the deliberate burial of the BVY account in the cooperation documents, the information provided to federal investigators about the timeline of the investigation that allowed him to time the closure, The coordination with the Coastal Meridian principles that had been ongoing since before he joined Sterling Meridian was explicit, detailed, and corroborated by the banking records and the documents Ethan and Isabella had assembled. Richard Sterling had never been charged with anything. He had stepped down voluntarily as part of an agreement negotiated by his lawyer in response to an investigation that had been quietly, deliberately steered away from the actual fraud and toward the appearance of one. His name had simply existed in the public record adjacent to a scandal he didn't commit, which was its own kind of sentence because the public record doesn't have a mechanism for saying this man is here for the wrong reason. Now it did. Okafor's office issued a statement, careful, legal in its precision, but clear, that the 2012 investigation's conclusions regarding Richard Sterling's involvement had been materially affected by incomplete and deliberately manipulated disclosure. Sterling's lawyer filed the supporting documentation with the appropriate federal office. A supplemental entry was added to the case record. It wasn't a headline. It didn't make the front page because front pages don't generally cover the correction of quiet injustices, only their commission. A few business publications ran brief items. The Charleston paper ran 4 paragraphs on the inside of the business section. Richard Sterling didn't read any of them. Ethan knew this because Isabella told him, and she told him with the specific tone of someone who found it both frustrating and completely predictable. He said he already knew what happened, she said. He said reading about it in the paper wasn't going to change what he already knew. He's not wrong. I know he's not wrong. She sighed. I wanted him to have something to point to, something external. He has the case record, Ethan said. That's external. He just doesn't need to wave it around to feel it. She thought about this. He's going out for a nice dinner with his old friend from the board, the one who never believed any of it. They're going to the place on East Bay they used to go to in the 90s. She paused. I think that's actually the right way to do it. Sounds right to me. Are you going to tell me you've learned something profound from all of this about justice and what it actually means? No, he said. Good. I was going to tell you to stop. I figured. She was quiet for a moment. Not the heavy quiet she'd carried through October and November, but something easier, something that had a little space in it. Ethan, she said, can I ask you something personal? You can ask. When you left the federal job, when you made the choice to leave, do you regret it? He thought about it honestly, the way he always did when he decided something was worth thinking about honestly. No, he said. The work there, the framework of it, it wasn't built for the kind of patience I needed to have. Cases that should have gone one way went another because of factors that had nothing to do with the evidence. I was good at the work, but I was bad at the parts around the work. The bureaucracy, the politics. He paused. And Sarah needed me. And then she was gone, and Noah needed me. Those weren't sacrifices. They were just what mattered more. And now? Now I do the work I was good at in a context where I can control more of the variables. And I picked Noah up at 3:30. He looked at the kitchen wall. The certificate was still on the refrigerator. It's not a perfect arrangement, but it's mine. Do you miss it? The bigger stage? Sometimes, he said, which was more honest than he usually let himself be about it. But missing something and wanting it back are different things. He paused. I found something that mattered in a $50 million contract that everyone else had already signed off on. I did something useful. That's enough. Is it really? Yeah, he said. It really is. She was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about something, she said, about the decision you made in that boardroom, tearing the contract. You said afterward that you didn't plan it, that you just reached a point where leaving the document on the table felt impossible. That's accurate. What made it impossible? Really? He thought about the specific moment. Standing at the front of the room, his presentation finished, the weight of 45 minutes in the air, Isabella looking at the contract with that uncertain expression, the gathered momentum of money and schedule, and everyone's investment in the day going the way they'd planned. I've watched things go wrong before because someone had the information and didn't act on it at the right moment, he said. The 2012 case, other cases before that. The evidence existed, the right people had it, And then the moment passed and the momentum carried things forward and the evidence sat in a file and the wrong thing happened. He paused. I've spent a long time thinking about what the difference is between the moments that get interrupted and the moments that don't. I think the difference is usually just one person deciding the discomfort of acting is less than the discomfort of not acting and doing it before they think too hard. That's not a particularly sophisticated moral framework. No, but it's the one that works. She was quiet for a moment, and he could almost hear her turning that over. I want to tell you something, she said, and I want you to just listen and not be awkward about it. That's a setup that historically produces the opposite effect. Ethan, a slight sharpness, the familiar kind. I spent 12 years building something because I was angry. I was angry at what happened to my father, and I was angry at the people who did it, and I was angry at myself for not being able to fix it. And I poured all of that into the company, which worked, in the sense that the company grew. But the anger was the engine, and engines burn fuel, and I was getting tired in a way that I couldn't identify clearly. She paused. And then a man walked into a boardroom with gas station coffee and a juice box stain on his sleeve and said no when everyone else had already said yes. And now the thing I've been angry about for 12 years is being corrected in a federal document, and the man who did it is facing a real consequence, and my father is going to dinner on East Bay. She stopped. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found it. Signed the contract, probably. And the company would have survived that. I would have found out eventually, maybe, and dealt with it. But the other part, my father, that correction, I might never have gotten there. Her voice was steady, but with something underneath it. So, thank you for not looking away when it would have been a lot easier to look away. Ethan sat with that. He thought about all the things he could say, the deflections he was good at, the redirects toward practical matters, the gentle dismantling of significance that had been a professional habit for years and a personal one for longer. He didn't say any of them. You're welcome, he said, and meant it simply. Check. January moved into February. The Hargrove case ground forward with the slow machinery of federal prosecution. Depositions, documentation requests, cooperation sessions that Rosario occasionally briefed Ethan on in the oblique way she briefed him on things now, which was to say in a way that was technically not a breach of anything, but was also not precisely by the book. The Coastal Meridian principals had retained lawyers of their own and were fighting the cooperation evidence with the specific energy of men who had been very confident for a very long time and had not yet fully processed that the confidence was no longer warranted. Okafor expected the full trial to begin in the fall. He expected it to result in convictions. Ethan told Isabella this on a Tuesday in February, when he came in for a scheduled review of 2 new vendor contracts that the outside counsel had flagged for additional scrutiny. They sat in the conference room on 37, not the boardroom, which had acquired a certain weight neither of them had articulated, but both apparently felt, with 2 cups of coffee from the machine on 14 that actually worked, and a stack of documents between them. The vendor contracts were clean, both of them. No unusual ownership structures, no Cayman Islands holding companies, no registered agents in Tortola. It's almost boring, Isabella said, flipping the last page. Boring is good, Ethan said. I know boring is good. She set the document down. It's still almost boring. He looked at her and she looked at him, and after a moment they both found the same thing faintly funny without exactly laughing about it, which was a specific kind of shared recognition that had developed over the months since October and which he'd stopped trying to categorize. The COO search, he said. How's that going? Slowly, intentionally. She picked up her coffee. I interviewed someone last week who looked very good on paper, and in the first 10 minutes I thought, this person will never tell me I'm wrong. Too smooth, too interested in being right for the room. She looked at the cup. I sent Hargrove's recommendation letter, which he wrote 3 years ago for someone he was mentoring. I looked at it again last week. It was beautifully written, full of the right words about leadership and integrity. She paused. I keep thinking about how people who are good at a certain kind of deception are also, necessarily, good at performing the opposite of deception, and how you can't always tell the difference in advance. No, he said, you can't always. So how do you choose? Carefully, slowly, and you build in mechanisms that don't depend on trust alone. He looked at her. You had me review 2 vendor contracts today that your outside counsel had already reviewed. That's a mechanism. Yes. It doesn't eliminate risk. Nothing does. But it creates more surfaces where something wrong can be caught. He paused. And you look for people who push back, not performers. Not people who push back theatrically to demonstrate their independence. People who push back quietly, specifically, with reasons. Those people are uncomfortable to work with sometimes. But they're the ones who will find the problem before it's too late. She looked at him for a moment. Like a compliance reviewer with a juice box stain on his sleeve, she said. Something like that. She smiled. A real one. The kind that changed her whole face in a way the professional version didn't. It was still something he didn't see often enough to take for granted. I have a candidate interview in March, she said. I'd like you to meet them. That's not part of my retainer scope. I know. I'm asking anyway. He thought about it. Okay, he said. March. Then April. The COO position was filled. A woman named Dr. Carmen Vega, 51, who had run operations for a healthcare conglomerate and who, in her first meeting with the full leadership team, had quietly and specifically corrected a financial projection that 3 people in the room had already approved. Isabella had looked at Ethan after the meeting. He had nodded once. She had offered Carmen the job the following week. Ethan met with 3 other clients in the spring and produced compliance reports for all of them, 2 of which found nothing of note, and 1 of which identified a concerning pattern in a partnership agreement that saved the client approximately $11 million and a substantial amount of future embarrassment. He worked from home mostly, from the kitchen table mostly, from the same chair where he'd been sitting when he opened the Coastal Meridian files for the first time in early October. He fixed the cabinet door in the kitchen. He wasn't sure when exactly he decided to do it. He just found himself in front of it one Saturday morning with a screwdriver, adjusting the hinge, and it took 4 minutes, and when it was done the door hung level and he stood and looked at it and thought about Sarah in the way he thought about her now. Not with the same weight it used to carry, not without weight either, but as a fact of his life that had shaped him without destroying him, which was the best outcome you could hope for from a loss that size. Noah turned 8 in April. They had a small birthday party. 6 kids from school, a backyard in the April warmth, a cake that Noah had requested be shaped like an anglerfish, and that Ethan had attempted with mediocre results. The anglerfish looked more like an abstract interpretation of a fish than a specific species, but Noah declared it the best cake he'd ever seen, which was either genuine or generous, and Ethan chose to believe it was genuine. Isabella came. She showed up with a wrapped present and stood slightly to the side of the chaos in the way of someone who wasn't entirely sure of the social geometry, but was committing to being there anyway. Noah opened the present, a high-quality Lego set, the serious kind designed for older builders, and went immediately to show her which piece he was going to start with. She crouched down to his level and listened with full attention. Ethan watched from across the yard and thought about the specific surprise of it, how people reveal themselves in small, unscripted moments, how Isabella Sterling, billionaire, CEO, the woman who had rebuilt a dead company with her bare hands and sat across from a federal agent in a hard chair and faced down 15 years of quiet betrayal with composure. How she crouched in a backyard and listened to an 8-year-old talk about Lego with the same focused attention she gave financial documents. He thought that was probably the best thing he'd learned about her. Not the composure in crisis, which was impressive but also expected from someone who'd had no choice but to develop it, but this. The willingness to be fully present in the small moments, even the ones that weren't her territory. Richard Sterling came too. He arrived late and a little out of breath, having walked from the parking spot he'd found 3 blocks away because he'd refused to circle the block again. He shook Ethan's hand and accepted a paper plate with cake on it and found a chair near the fence and watched the chaos of 8-year-olds in a backyard with the expression of a man who had come out the other side of something and found the light better than he'd remembered. At some point in the late afternoon, when the party had wound down and the other kids had been collected and Noah was sitting in the corner of the yard very seriously reading the Lego instruction manual, Richard sat next to Ethan on the back steps. "My lawyer tells me the federal record amendment is complete," Richard said. "The correction is official." He had a cup of coffee that had gone cold, which he was holding anyway. "Good." It doesn't change much, practically. The company's been in Isabella's hands for years. People who were going to believe I was guilty still believe it, mostly because people don't update their beliefs as readily as you'd hope. He paused. But it changes what I know when I read my own name. Ethan nodded. She told me what you said to her, the morning of the arrest. Richard looked at the yard. That you didn't think it went the way it was supposed to, the 2012 case. I said it before I knew how right it was, Ethan said. You said it anyway. Richard was quiet for a moment. What made you say it? You were walking out. You'd done what you came to do. What made you stop and say that? Ethan thought about it. Really thought about it. Not the quick reflex answer, but the actual one. Because I'd been carrying it for a while, he said. The 2012 case. What I found, what got buried, what didn't happen that should have. I carried it for years without saying it to anyone directly connected to it because there was never a moment where it was the right thing to say. He looked at the yard, at Noah bent over the Lego manual, at the April light going long and warm across the grass. And then I was standing in a doorway, and the person it most mattered to was in the room, and it was the only moment there was going to be. So I said it. Richard was quiet for a long time. Thank you, he said. Not elaborately, just the two words. You don't need to thank me. I know I don't need to, Richard said. That's why I'm doing it. They sat on the back steps in the April warmth and didn't say anything else for a while, which was the right amount. On a Sunday afternoon in late April, one of those southern spring days where the warmth is genuine and the light is different from winter light in a way you feel before you see it, Ethan drove to the waterfront with Noah. They walked the Battery, the old seawall along the harbor. It was a Sunday, so there were people, families, joggers, couples, the usual cast of a city taking advantage of good weather. The harbor was the same as always. It would always be the same as always. That was the thing about water. Noah was eating an ice cream that was melting faster than he could keep up with, which he was handling with the resigned pragmatism of someone who understood the terms of the transaction. Dad, he said, walking. Yeah. Is the important job done? Ethan thought about how to answer that. The main part of it, yeah. Are you going to keep working for her, the CEO? For a while, as a consultant. Noah considered this. Is she nice? He thought about it. She's direct. She works hard. She says what she thinks and she expects other people to do the same. He looked at the water. Yeah, she's nice. She remembered about the space station, Noah said. That's a good sign. It is. Can we go back sometime to the tall building? Probably. She'd need a reason. Tell her I want to show her the new version. I made some modifications. I'll relay that. Noah ate his ice cream. They walked. The harbor did what harbors do. Dad, Noah said after a while. Yeah. You look different this year, like in October and November. You looked like you were working on something that mattered. Ethan looked down at him. I do work that matters. I know, but this was different. Noah looked up at him with the calm, frank assessment that Ethan had spent 8 years being slightly unprepared for. You looked like yourself, like the full version. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. He thought about October, about the gas station coffee and the manila folder and the boardroom and the sound of paper tearing and the long weeks after. About Rosario's voice on the phone and Okafor's fluorescent light and Richard Sterling sitting on a bench by the water. About Isabella in a dozen different configurations, reading documents at midnight, crouching in a backyard, laughing that real unguarded laugh, walking into a boardroom the morning of an arrest, and presenting the truth like it was the only thing she had and the only thing she needed. He thought about what it meant to find something that mattered and not look away from it. He thought about the window he'd finally fixed, the cabinet door, the certificate on the refrigerator. He thought about the gap between the person you are in the moments that require everything and the person you are in the ordinary minutes between them, and whether those two people are actually the same person or just two versions of the same material organized differently under different pressures. He thought his son was probably right, that there was a version of himself that came into focus when the work was real, and that keeping some version of that alive was worth whatever it cost. You might be right, he said. I usually am, Noah said, which was accurate enough that Ethan didn't bother disagreeing. They walked to the end of the seawall and stood looking at the water. The harbor spread out wide and silver gray under the afternoon sun, and across it the islands were dark green in the April light, and beyond them the channel opened toward the ocean, which opened toward everything else. Noah finished his ice cream. He looked at the water. Then he looked up at his father. What happens next? He said. It was a child's question, and also the only question, and Ethan looked at the harbor the way he'd looked at it 100 times from a dozen different vantage points over the past 6 months, and he thought that the honest answer was that he didn't know, which was not a failure of planning, but simply the true condition of being alive and still in the middle of things. Not sure, he said. Something. Noah seemed to find this acceptable. He took his father's hand the way he still did sometimes, not as often as he used to, more than he probably would next year. They stood at the seawall together while the April sun moved and the harbor stayed the same, and the city went on doing what cities do. Not everything that had been broken was fixed. That was not how these things worked. There were things Ethan still carried that he would carry for a long time. There were things Isabella was still building back toward. There were years Richard Sterling couldn't recover, and losses that predated all of it, and truths that had arrived too late to undo the damage they might have prevented. But the lie had been spoken out loud and identified as a lie. The person responsible was answering for it. The record had been corrected. The company would survive. The small, good things were still happening. An 8-year-old's hand in his, the harbor in the April light, the ordinary, ongoing fact of a life that had continued past the worst of itself and come out somewhere worth being. It wasn't a clean ending, but it was a true one. And Ethan Calloway, who had walked into a boardroom 6 months ago with gas station coffee and a juice box stain on his sleeve and no plan beyond saying what he'd found, Ethan Calloway was fine with that. He'd learned a long time ago that clean endings were mostly fiction. The true ones were better anyway.